Hello, hello. We are actually impromptu popping into a panel, so we'll see how this goes. We will see how this goes. Virtual camera started. Huzzah. I have no idea what's going to happen here. I'm keeping up, so we'll see.
But even beyond that, right, I would state that in a socialist structure, it can also incentivize toxic behavior, because right now, as it stands, the amount of money that interpersonally we stand to gain as a result of perpetuating racist ideas and stereotypes is pretty much just like clout or interpersonal stuff like that. Maybe if you're politically oriented, you're running like some kind of political campaign or something like that, you stand to gain money. But for the most part, it's not financial, and with a socialist system, you could have millions of people benefiting financially off of a racist structure, so it could actually perpetuate racism and solidify it, because everybody has an incentive now financially to do it.
Speaking of financially incentives to do things, Sunday.
Hey.
Welcome.
Thank you.
So you've been watching this for a bit. I do want to give our friend E-Wade here a chance to respond to that. I want to hear his thoughts.
It's been a couple minutes since I have been listening in. I was listening in back when I first messaged you to bring me on. So I'll let you guys play it out a little bit more.
Sure.
Yeah.
But go ahead, E-Wade. What do you think of that response? Under socialism, or under a kind of a stateless socialistic system where, again, democratically owned corporations, democratically owned workplaces they simply wouldn't just. Oh, we can hear your crackling, Sunday. By the
Oh,
way.
I'm sorry.
Okay, it's a fine. That we wouldn't simply see people just willing to sell out and exploit their neighbor, uh, for gain, especially if that neighbor happens to be a minority of the population, and disliked in general.
I mean, that's what I'm talking about. And really, when I'm talking about sort of a stateless socialism type thing, I'm talking about the importance of rebuilding those social bonds and building up community again. Having real sense of community, not this text back and forth, not the whole internet nonsense back and forth, but actually like a sense of interpersonal connectivity. So that's the reason that has to be first. Now keep in mind, everything I'm saying is not going to happen instantaneously. So that's why it's important to build those social bonds so no one is alienated. So
I don't want to.
build-
I don't want to break the flow, but I am curious. Can somebody sort of recap where we're at in the conversation exactly?
I could try. So
Go ahead.
right now we're trying to figure out exactly why capitalism, as in comparison to different modes of economics systems, are going to perpetuate racism inherently. Meaning that what about capitalism is inherently racist and will not allow for a racially equal society?
That's interesting. And you and your thesis is that it is inherently racist.
Not mine.
Ewan, or Uade. Sorry, I don't know why I was calling you Ewan. Uade. Is that how you say your name?
Yeah, E-Wade.
Ewade. Ewade. My apologies.
Like D-Wade, like Dwayne Wade. Yeah.
Okay. So your thesis is that capitalism is inherently racist.
Yeah.
Okay. And we're talking capitalism even considered as an abstraction. So, for example, if you were to set up a capitalist system on the moon, something like that.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, as you were. Thank you.
So yeah, like I was just saying, really when I'm talking about community control of things, it involves building those social bonds. It involves reconnecting. This is going to take time. I know it's going to take time.
So I would say if racism is alleviated in any economic system we choose as a result of going through the processes that you're talking about, building that social community connection and things like that, I would say it was alleviated because of making those social community connections, not because of the change out from capitalism to a separate economic system. Right? I think that what you're describing actually is part of the way that we prevent interpersonal racism and racism when it comes to our economic system, which is again exposure to a group of people, also finding common ground amongst a group of people, and common ground can look like class, however it might be, right? And I think finding that with the people around you is going to be way more likely to alleviate any issues of racism than removing or changing the economic system.
Can I possibly help Ewade out here a little bit? Because I think,
Yeah.
That's why you're here.
yeah, I think
Yeah,
judging
go ahead.
from, fair enough. I think judging from what I'm hearing, I understand, I think, where Ewade's coming from, but I'm seeing like a critical part of the argument that's not really being furnished here. Relly. Do I call you Relly, or what do I call you?
Sure.
Okay, Relly.
That.
I think this is the first time speaking, by the way. Nice to meet you.
It's nice to meet you.
When we're talking about how, for example, solidarity within a class can overcome racial divides, that may be true under certain circumstances, but I think there's sort of an additional layer to this that gives rise to class divisions as well as racial divisions in an identical fashion. So, if you're, for example, let's go full Marxian here. If you're somebody who owns the means of production, you're not somebody who has to labor in order to make a wage in order to live. Your relationship to capitalism is going to be radically different than somebody who has to work in order to live. Why? Because within a capitalist market system, your wage is hypothetically the return on you selling your labor, right? A capitalist does not have to sell their labor. therefore, you end up with a situation of de facto exploitation. Why? Because you have people whose social existence is determined by their capacity to commodify themselves. They become a part of the exchange as well. And one of the things that racial divisions does is it provides a very useful alibi for getting that at a premium at some level. And so I think I disagree. I'm going to disagree with Ewade's thesis that it's inherently racist simply because we can imagine an identical system formally taking place in a situation without racial divisions at all. We can imagine it taking place in a situation that's totally racially homogenous, in which case it would be a little bit absurd to say that the system is therefore racist. But it seems to me like it furnishes us with not the only one historically that we've had. We've had other excuses for exploiting other groups of people, but it furnishes us with one of the most effective and potent ones for doing so along very strong economic lines. It gives us a framework to allow racism to seep in at a very deep structural level to how we live as communities. Does that make sense?
That makes sense to me.
That's personally how I would have gone about this line of the argumentation. I don't want to usurp you there, Ewade. I haven't heard everything you had to say.
I guess
No,
to back up
maybe.
the, if I may, to back up the inherently racist, however, part of it is one of the thing about markets specifically, is it's always going to favor the majority. So if you have a country like we do in America where we have 70-60% are part of the in-group, and then you have various out-groups, right? People of color, indigenous people, etc. They tend to have different economic needs. And what I mean by that is they value different things in the market. But because markets will always go towards the majority, it's just inherently going to make it harder and less capable for the minority, whatever they want, whatever they happen to need, to get what they want and they need. There's going to be less infrastructure dedicated towards it. There's going to be less of everything, less advertisement, etc. Capitalism, by its very nature, and these markets, by their very nature, are going to propagate the hegemony, right? Propagate the whatever structure happens to be in power. And again, that has historically tended to be along racial lines, at least in America. And so it has kind of gotten us stuck. So while it might not have caused racism, it makes it harder and harder to get away from racism. Does that make sense?
What do you mean when you say it favors the markets favor the majority? Can you elaborate on that?
So what I mean by that is, so say you have a large group, a city, millions of people, and most of the people in that city, right? They enjoy, I don't know, soda. They like Coke. Coke's great. They love Coke. Okay. Coke should be cheap. Coke should be plentiful. The market will be saturated with Coke. But if you have a minority group in there who, for whatever reason, does not like Coke and instead likes another drink or another product, they are not going to be able to have these things. And when we talk about culture and how that relates to race, obviously there are different things that along cultural and ethnic lines.
I see what you're saying. So if I can
Does that
put
make
this,
sense?
well, if I could,
Yeah.
maybe you can clarify it for me. I'll put it into my own words. So what you're saying is, given our propensity under capitalism to let sort of market logic determine how we make decisions, there is going to be an overwhelming tendency for smaller and smaller groups to be essentially held in contempt and neglected in decision-making processes. And we see this a lot, for example. We have a mutual friend, incidentally, who applies the same logic in politics, where we have, for example, open contempt for non-binary identities, et cetera, because they're just too weird to sell as part of a populist political platform, so the logic goes. Things of that sort. That's sort of where you're going with this?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Again,
Yeah.
I'm not of that opinion, but I'm trying to steelman it as best as I can. So.
Oh, you're not of that opinion. What opinion are you of?
Well, I don't believe capitalism is inherently racist. I think it's a very anti-racist tool. I think that the only color that capitalism cares about at the end of the day is green. It's money. And if you have money, regardless if you're black, white, Asian, whatever, you will succeed in this system in a way that you probably couldn't under a more democratic system, simply because you don't have to
But
rely
surely,
on your peers.
but surely, if I may,
What is the opportunity
I'm Wick,
cost?
not Shirley. But go ahead, E-Wade. I want to hear from E-Wade.
after you.
What is the opportunity cost of that success, though?
There certainly are some, right? It tends to be on the backs of others, but that's not necessarily on racial lines. Right?
It ends up playing out a lot of times that way. It's not solely on racial lines, but it ends up playing out that way.
I disagree. I mean, historically, yes, but I think that capitalism has been a tool that has allowed people of color, especially, right, to move on up, to break out of the communities that they're in, of the red lines that they've been placed in. If you have enough money, racism hits you a lot less hard in a capitalism system. Yeah, it'll still be an effect on you, but you don't have to worry about the effects of racism if you have money as much as you would if you were poor.
Well, I think
Now, under a more democratic system, right, I don't think you would be able to. I don't think the individual would be as empowered to get away from these systems as they are under capitalism. I think the empowerment of the individual that happens under capitalism is absolutely one of the biggest ways for people to escape from their racist surroundings, if you will.
so. I think
What about the inherent instability inside of capitalism itself?
inherent instability.
Crashes on average every 4 to 7 years.
That's not. That's not. I don't think that's inherent to capitalism, though. Like capitalism persists. Besides that, what you're talking about are I guess, contradictions and unfortunate sort of dynamics of finance at a certain level. That's not really an argument against capitalism per se. Capitalism survived these just fine.
You wanted
What was-
to say something irrelevant?
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, me. I was curious of what President Sunday wanted to get in there at the same time you wait. I was.
Yeah,
Oh,
go ahead.
well, thank you. So Wick, I think I would concede pretty readily that any sort of system that doesn't specifically register race as a component of its constitution, taken formally, you can imagine situations in which, just by adhering formally to the system and ignoring racial characteristics or racial groups, you would have a necessarily non-racist system, sort of necessity. That was redundant, but you get the idea. However, I want to bring us back again to like the specific nature of capitalism in particular, the specific class relations that it sort of presumes structurally. And it does presume them structurally because there's going to be a class of people that doesn't have to sell their labor, and there's going to be a class of people that does. And as a consequence of having to sell their labor and that labor becoming a commodity that's exchanged with other things, that class now becomes sort of a fungible mass, right? When we talk about, for example, how much work goes into the production of some item, we don't specify how much of polishing, how much of screwing, how much of this is all very unfortunate language, but to get to the point. We have a class of people that is treated essentially as an element, as kind of a standing reserve that you draw from like a resource. And we have a class of people who aren't. And one of the worries I would have is that historically, if we're coming out of a situation which we have a proliferation of land grabs across the globe by people who identify according to specific racial characteristics, these class divides are going to correspond to other things besides just who in the abstract happens to own land and who doesn't. The people who own land are going to be of a certain set of characteristics. The people who don't are going to be of a certain set of characteristics. And that's going to drive racial divides, if they exist in a given situation, deep into the economic constitution of a society or of a system. And so, this is why, like, I sort of agree with you in principle. Like, I understand where you're going with the idea that a formal system that doesn't register race, it's not necessarily racist in and of itself. However, when we're talking about capitalism, we're not just talking about a formal system. We're talking about something that's emergent within a racial system within and on top of racial
But the
systems.
question would become, right?
Yes.
Is it more or less racist than any other system that would have emerged? And I think what mechanisms within that economic system
I would say so.
would
I would say
help
so, and
or hurt racism?
well, I would say so, and I'll tell you why. Because
Okay.
taken as a merely formal structure, once again, if it doesn't register race, and the concept of race is not very old as we understand it today, given that any formal system, if it doesn't register race, would not be racist, it having an inbuilt class exploitation element to it that provides the perfect slot for race as a one of the characterizing features of people who end up in here as opposed to here, I would say that it makes it certainly tend more towards entrenching racism than potentially any other system.
You want to respond to that, Irrelevant, or should I?
Yeah, sure.
Barring offshoots afterwards, like I'm not going to argue that capitalism is more racist than some construction of a modern fascist or something.
Okay. So, the so an issue that I had was kind of some of the statements before about how there is a certain class of people who's seen as a resource, and there's certain classes of people who are not. Even capital owners are literally a resource. That is what they are. They're a resource. They have a pool of money that is quite literally used daily as a resource to be able to perpetuate the operations
We can
of the corporation.
Yeah. If I can, do you mind if I jump in right there? I don't mean to cut you off, but yeah, please.
Did you get Irrelevant? I don't think Irrelevant.
I did. Yeah, I did want. Yeah, I wanted to
connect the dots first
Yeah.
before. Yeah.
So with that, the second portion was the idea that this class specific orientation of the economic system is going to lean more heavily into perpetuating racism. I'm not sure, again, I agree with this idea on the basis of things that I was saying to E-Wade, because if we agree with the idea that there's certain economic advantages to exploiting racism, whether it be inside of media or what have you, then what we would be doing is, instead of having those exploits and those gains be given to a small group of people, they would now be given to a wider group of people. So now there's everyday Americans who are benefiting off of racism. Not only potentially, if you agree with the idea that there's a lot of Americans who benefit off of racism interpersonally, now financially they benefit off of racism. So I really don't see any tangible argument that these individuals would have a massive desire to change the system.
Hold that thought on the second one, because I'm probably going to need you to recapitulate it in a second. But for the first one, in terms of owners also being a resource, true, we can very easily conceive of owners themselves, for example, being a flow or a channeling of material that we can characterize as resources. But what I'm specifically talking about is vis-a-vis the market, when we are talking about how things are exchanged in a capitalist system. The labor of a worker is what is traded. And so the worker, the laborer, becomes fungible with other people. The owner doesn't. The owner as an individual is an actor who owns resources that go beyond his person, beyond their capacity to sort of sell their time and their body's work, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so you end up in a situation, once again, where, yeah, it's true. The entire world is comprised of all of the same energy that comes from the sun. But when we're talking about human relations under a capitalist system, we're talking specifically about a system in which labor is traded. And so if you don't need to trade your labor, there's a divide there. It's an insurmountable one, because you're fundamentally just not of a kind in terms of your behavior and how you live from those other people. And you have a level of power over that those other people don't have. Because if you have to trade your labor, you have to trade your labor, right? Your existence and your well-being, et cetera, is conditioned on an action that it's simply not for those other people. And those other people own the things that facilitate you trading your labor, et cetera. Can you let me know if that gave you any problems, and can you restate the second one, because that was a little bit long and I didn't entirely follow it.
Okay, so when you say, did that give me any problems, are you asking for a response to that, or are you asking...
I'm just... I didn't want to brush over if you had any issue with what I was saying.
Okay, so my, I guess, issue with it is the idea that one, typically when we're viewing money, we're viewing it as in an exchange of labor that has happened in the past, right? That is supposed to be the idea. And I agree that in general, like especially with modern ways that capitalism is
Do we view money that way?
practiced, it's not perfect. It's sorry. What I'm trying to say is
Yeah.
that money is the physical embodiment of labor being exchanged in the past. That's what money is supposed to be, in theory. Is it's supposed to be, this is an extension of what your labor has provided. Use it to be able to exchange for other labor. That's what it's supposed to be. So when, for instance, as an example, let's say we both get paid $10,000 a year or something like that, incredibly low amount of money, doesn't really matter. Our expenses are roughly $5,000.
I'm on YouTube. That's probably not too far off. Continue, please.
Yeah, hey, listen, hey, we all are struggling out here. $5,000 a month, let's say, or $5,000 a year for expenses. But then let's say I'm really bad at spending my money on top of that, so I like waste a bunch of it or whatever. But you keep saving, and then you get to the point where yada yada.
Sure.
You get to the point where you accumulate a bunch of money, and then you're able to spend it in a different place. That is supposed to be ideally how money works. So when we're talking about these people, this class of people that are capable of doing that, and putting significant amounts of money up front to be able to own portions of businesses, we are talking about people that, in theory, again, got this as a result of taking their labor in the past
Right.
and applying it to something currently. Not only that, but also another response that I have to that is actually a fair chunk of everyday ordinary people actually do own some means of or some shares in companies. This is very common in retirement funds and things like that. So a lot of everyday people actually do own shares and stake in company. They are shareholders, similar to, they just not on the scale of other people. And
Well, sure, but I mean, like, fundamentally, if at the end of the day they still have to sell their labor, it's kind of a moot distinction because their existence is still predicated on that. But I hear what you're saying. So if I'm
also, I just want to make sure I understand.
I'll shut up after
if you want to
this.
get in. You wait if you want to
Yeah.
get in. Just don't. You're new here.
Just
so
push.
what I'm saying is, yeah,
just push. You
elbow your way
gotta.
in.
Yeah, this is
Okay, I was just listening, just letting it go.
this is
Let it go by.
If you have, but this is how this works. If you have a point, elbow your way in here. Just get in there.
Wick TV is a land of lawlessness and depravity.
Okay.
If I hear you correctly, the essence of your retort is capitalism as such doesn't actually bar people of different racial designations, even if, for example, of racial designations that have historically in the territory we're talking about or wherever have been kept out at some point in the past. They are still able to buy property. They are still able to. There's social mobility upwards is still a possibility. They can even own the means of productions after a certain level, after a certain time. Fair enough. I don't disagree with that whatsoever. Once again, like any formal system that doesn't register race, if it provides avenues equally to everybody, then the formal system itself is not intrinsically racist. But if we're talking about a system that is in history, if we're talking about the real thing itself, and not sort of like a map of it sort of drawn in the abstract that ignores the details of how it comes to be, if it takes place in a situation in which race is practically registered as a condition of wealth or a condition of access, and it wasn't that long ago that it was in very formal terms, segregation went on to the middle point of the last century, then you will see correlations, very, very strong correlations between class and race in a way that would not be so easily facilitated by a different system. Now, prejudice can still have similar outcomes in terms of like disparate health, wealth, etc. But capitalism formally provides the easiest way to insert that in a formal sense or in a de facto sense as a strict part of its overall structure, precisely because there is that direct relationship between your place in the capitalist system and your financial independence or your economic independence.
Okay,
Yeah.
as opposed to what system though? Like
As opposed
so
to what
for
system?
Yeah. Like, what system are you referring to that would not have these same problems? and why?
Formally, I think any system might not have these same problems, including capitalism. Incidentally, the issue we have is not that capitalism as a system is intrinsically racist. I do disagree with the thesis of the panel to that extent. However, capitalism as it has emerged historically is intrinsically racist insofar as it has emerged alongside racist systems, and therefore has basically opened its mouth to the racist influence of the places in which it has taken place, simply because, once again, if you have people separated economically along racial grounds as a result of specifically racial prejudice, that's going to correspond to people who are in a situation of economic dependency upon the capitalist system versus people who are solely beneficiaries of it. Once again, like, not necessary. We could imagine a situation in which that is purely rectified. Yeah.
Maybe we can break bread on this idea then. If I were to agree with some of the things that you said, would you agree with the idea that if we were in a socialist system, there would still be significant amounts of racism?
In a socialist system? Depends on what you mean by that. Potentially, yeah. Unless you actually break down the racial structures and conceptions, like even the notion, for example, of races being self-contained units that have to be treated as independent entities. That's gonna maintain a racist, at the very least, a racist overlay to whatever system you're deploying.
Sure. So, if we agree with at least that, so then I guess if you agree with that idea, if you had a similar situation as what you described as possibly not being a racist system that socialism could inhabit, if a capitalist system embodied those same concepts, would it be racist as well? Or would it not be racist?
If a capitalist system existed in a situation in which the very concept of race and I guess the concreteness in our imaginations of race as an entity, if that was gone, of course, yeah. That's why I was asking E-Wade if he would consider it to be intrinsically racist if it was on the moon.
Oh, okay. So then, then it sounds like we probably agree that there's certain underlying problems that are upstream from the economic issues that causes racial disparity inside of whatever system it is. And now we could speak maybe to the effects of racism as a result of the economic system, but I think ultimately the solutions for racism as it exists are things that are independent of the economic system.
Well, on the subject of fixing the system, this is where we need to be really careful between when we're talking about capitalism as the formal concept, like we've drawn out what are the bare conceptual necessities that we need to exist for us to have a capitalist system, and can we imagine that without race? Of course we can. And capitalism as it lives in the world. Because capitalism as it lives in the world, by receiving race as an input into who ends up in what class, that's going to reinforce itself as well. Now, as you aptly pointed out, there will, in cases, for actually far fewer people than you might expect, but at the very least within, for example, certain democratic states like the U.S., there will be opportunity for a lot of people who otherwise would have been in those lower classes to move up over time, especially as these states liberalize and expand political rights and so on and so forth. But within capitalism as a whole, it's still going to rely upon that at the global level. The distant manufacture, for example, is horrific, and there is no upward mobility for a child sweatshop worker who's supplying the Walmart clothing that I'm wearing right now. So you're correct, but the system as a whole, while it admits of mobility within it for some, it relies upon the distinction of one who owns and one who sells themselves, essentially. And you can't really get out of that. This is one of the reasons why, if, for example, you actually read Marx, socialism is not a different system opposed to capitalism, although there are socialist elements you can impose within liberal state systems and so on and so forth. It's a thing that takes place as a consequence of capitalism later on. Yeah. Wick, you look like you're in distress.
$5 from Shapringro Steam Tech to ask, I want to understand Sunday's position, which rests on worker versus capital owner. Is someone who plays poker for work a worker or a capital owner?
Someone who plays poker for work? Do they have to play poker for work?
They have to make money to eat, so I'm assuming.
Yeah, okay. So the difference is not whether or not somebody does things in their lives. Elon Musk can choose at any moment of his life to go work in the mines. He can do that. That's a thing he can do. Billionaires can choose to go to work like Ayn Rand protagonists and go work on the railways. What fundamentally distinguishes people of a worker class or a laboring class or whatever you like and people who own capital is that the people who own capital can generate income off of that itself. The people who labor have to sell their labor as a condition of their existence. And because of how we value commodities, because what's the value? Here's something really basic. How many cans of beer is this cup worth? Well, if this cup is worth 2 cans of beer, let's say, the reciprocal of this is this 2 cans of beer is worth 1 cup. That's the value of it. So what actually anchors that? Well, it's going to be at some abstract general level, how much quote unquote labor is required to generate these things. And so because labor has been turned into an abstract value that way, and because labor is what a worker sells and what defines the worker is turned into an abstract resource. The capitalist is the person in this system. The capitalist decides, facilitates, makes decisions, and does so not out of necessity, not out of like life and death necessity. Elon Musk can stop working. He can stop tweeting. God, it would probably expand his life if he did. He can stop doing anything. You, me, we can't. We don't have a choice. That's the distinguishing feature.
I wanna give E-Wade a chance to get in here. You've been quiet for a little bit.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to monopolize this.
It's fine.
No, you're all good.
Shouldn't have shaken this beer. That was dumb.
You want me to get in on that question, or
What your current thoughts on the whole situation, please?
really just made in terms of like what is made in terms of capital and labor? I mean, like I said, you have those with capital that can make money off the capital, and those who have to work. So with that, you have you have people living different realities, yet living in the same general country. So I guess where I don't know where I'm going with that there.
I don't know either.
So
I don't know where I'm going with that.
I guess I'd ask, if I may. So this idea of the labor theory of value that you're going on, I'm not sure if I buy it, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
So the labor theory of value, as you said, stated like two beers, 1 mug. How much labor does it take to produce each? And that's kind of where we get with the value and things like that. That's not how markets tend to work. I don't care how much labor it takes to produce what I want.
I know your error right away.
Well, you haven't even heard my
But I know exactly where you're going because I've heard this a million times before. No offense to you, very very smart people have made this mistake. When Marx is talking about value, he's not talking about what people set as a price or what the market is willing to bear. A better way to look at it is what sets the minimum viable price for a thing from the vantage point of a vendor. Because if the labor required exceeds in cost the funds you are getting in exchange for that, then that's going to anchor it. There will be a price that you set that will...
I agree. There's a floor.
Yeah.
There's a floor, or maybe you want to call it a ceiling. I don't know how you want to look at it, whether it's floor or ceiling, but there is a point where if Ahrelevant, I see you. Give me a minute, and I'll let you in. Okay, but I understand that if it costs more to produce it than it does that you can get from it from other sources, then absolutely, it's going to affect how much you can bear it. Now, this is taking out government subsidies and other things like that, which we see in play in things like airlines.
Well, yeah, but that
Subsidized
wouldn't be
market, et
the
cetera, et
market
cetera. But
determining
that's a
the.
different thing.
You know, sure,
That's
but
an aside.
that wouldn't be the market determining the value of
But
the thing. That
the
would be a
problem
conscious
is,
interjection.
but the problem
Go on, sorry.
is that that's only the floor, because how high this price can go is not tied to the labor it is required to produce it.
Well, it is a
So
little
this
bit
could be
because
much
within the market. Well,
far more.
No, no,
This
no,
could
no,
be
no.
worth
Hang on.
far more. It could cost pennies
Sure,
to produce, and I
but
can make literally thousands of dollars off of it.
But Wick, there is competition in a market, and so therefore, if you are charging vastly in excess of what somebody else can charge, then they will charge less, and they will take away your business. And so, what Marx's labor theory of value dictates is not where prices land; it dictates what is the range of viable prices, and it doesn't determine it absolutely. In the world, there are going to be so many different exigencies that change what the actual prices are in the market. The fundamental point of all of this is not even to really determine what the prices of objects are, as if ultimately that's what we care about. The point of interest is that by dint of the value of labor being intrinsically defined by its relation to the production of commodities which are fungible with it, labor becomes fungible as well. Labor becomes a commodity. The point is that human labor itself becomes commodified. That's the point of interest. It becomes a thing that is sold on the marketplace, which defines... Go on, please.
Sure. I want to toss it to Ahrelevant because he was... Once you're done.
Coward.
Yeah, I was dying, okay?
I know.
Labor has absolutely nothing to do even with the value range of a given product.
Of course it does.
The reason why... And here, well, let me tell you the reason why.
Okay.
The reason why is because we're talking about an investment in an idea of that value. So let's say something cost me $2 million to make.
Yeah.
Right? I can give it away for absolutely free,
Sure.
even though the labor cost is so vastly. I can pay people to be able to have this product. We've seen it happen with celebrities where they get like cars and they're paid
Sure,
to have
yeah.
this vehicle so that way they can drive it around. The range has nothing to do with the labor. We're not going to go, oh, well, it's $2 million. So like this range is clearly
No.
It's
But what you're talking about, though, is not things being put up on the market.
You gotta let him finish. Let him
It's
finish.
what do I think I'm going to get as a result of offering this product to this person at this specific whatever it is. Okay, let's say I have something that costs 1 penny to produce, right, as a result of the labor, right? I can offer it, I can give it to somebody for $100 million, absolutely, if I believe that's going to net me $101 million in returns. It's all about what do I believe. But that's ultimately the idea that value is based on what I perceive other people as willing to
No. I don't disagree with you at all. But what you're talking about is not commodity exchange. What you're talking about is people actually not engaging in capitalism because they foresee an additional benefit down the line, like an advertisement or something like that.
No, that is capitalism.
No. Well, it's not capitalism because it's not concerned with the exchange of labor as a commodity on the market. That's sort of what defines capitalism. You sell your labor in order to make a living, which you can then exchange for commodities, which have become fungible with labor as a result.
So wait, in your mind, after there has been an exchange between the laborers and the individuals who pay the laborers, it's no longer about capitalism.
I'm sorry?
Or I'm confused. I'm confused.
No, because what you're describing is not a market exchange. What you're describing is somebody giving away their possessions because they see a social benefit or an advertising benefit or something else down the line.
But that is a market benefit. It's advertising.
It pertains to the market, but it isn't the market. And we're talking about the market under capitalism. We are talking about commodity exchange specifically. That's actually a crucial element of it. Hi, FD Signifier.
Hello. I agree that commodity exchange is a significant part of the market, but the idea that advertising...
But crucially, though, it defines the market under capitalism.
So advertising is, and this was actually very common. There was a lot of interesting things going on in, I believe, the 50s and 60s that are regarding exactly what you're referring to. And it actually addressed one of the points where you were talking about how, hey, Wick, if you offer to sell your Coke at $1,000, somebody's going to undercut your price, and then you're going to be priced out of the market. That's not true. we see multiple different.
But if I may, very quickly, you're making so many errors, and I just want to save you from yourself.
Okay.
As a good socialist, that is what I do. You're right. Everything you're saying is true. People can do that. People can defy, for example, what will, on average, be the. You can think of it like mechanically, like if.
I thought you said very quickly, Sunday.
Well, very quickly for me. Look, you can defy at a loss. Okay, market dynamics. What pressures you to put something at a certain price? What makes that a risk, however, what makes it a risk to give away the product is precisely the fact that you had to expend a certain amount of labor to produce it in the first place. And there will be a range between you selling it for this, that's not a risk. This gives you a profit. You sell it too much, other people will undercut you because they'll make it for cheaper. That still exists, even if it's never honored. That's what the labor theory of value is concerned with. It's not concerned with what people in the world actually sell for, if they sell for at all. Like, obviously, Marx wasn't stupid. He knew that people could, for example, sell lower than the value of an object, or sell like unviably higher than the value of an object, so high that nobody pays for it, or only a crazy person pays for it. Right?
Okay, so if what you're referring to then is that there is, when you're talking about the labor theory of value, only that there is a concept of which is returns on investment, then sure.
Well, no, because it's not returns on investment. This is very critical. The point of the labor theory of value is not to determine the individual prices of specific objects in the world. The point of the labor theory of value is to account for what connects the amount of labor sold by a worker, what anchors that, to the amount of commodities it can buy, right?
Okay, we have gone down a little bit of a rabbit hole here, and I want to kind of pull it back to the topic at hand if we can, which is how do these systems, how does this labor theory of value, if you want to call it that, relate to racism and relate to the structures that uphold racism? We're joined by our esteemed colleague here, FD Signifier. Hello.
Esteemed colleague. Oh, that's a warmer welcome than I maybe even deserved.
It's not a compliment, it's Wick.
I'm sorry. I'm just popping in. I was watching earlier, and there's a couple things that I wanted to just chime in on, and then I won't just come in and give a speech and leave, of course. But one thing that I think bothered me by the argument was, I personally don't believe socialism is some magical bean that will solve racism. I want to be very clear on that. Socialism historically has a mixed results in that regard. Many of the biggest voices many of the bearded men have some sketchy histories with racism, and let alone like sexism. Like that is just, that's why intersectionality became a thing. It was because, like, look, you guys are doing a good job of analyzing these labor issues and work issues and money issues, but also you're still racist and sexist. So we're gonna like add this wrinkle to the equation. And one of the reasons that intersectionality was useful was because it's clear historically, at least in America, and I won't get too big from our britches and talk about places outside of my actual expertise, that racism was a fundamental feature of capitalism in America. So much so that pretty much all of the major figures in the civil rights movement were left of sockdems, right? With Martin Luther King probably being the most centrist lying, and that was mostly on a religious basis at the time. And then if you look at just the history of active socialist movements in America, like people that really got busy on the topic, it's basically white academics and the black working class, mixing that a little bit with like the Panthers, right? So the reason for that is because the thing that I think was missing from the conversation, at least that I saw, was the fact that capitalism requires surplus labor. Capitalism requires pretty much a permanent underclass. And here in America, that has been designated to black people. This is to put it simply. And until, and there will be no way to unleash black people from that position with capitalism still in place, because capitalism is going to constantly find ways to reinforce that positionality for black people. Before anybody responds, I do want to say, Ahrelevant, I want to talk to you in the future about being an incel, if that's okay with you. I actually left a comment a long time ago. And so I don't know when, because
really?
I planned videos. Yeah, I don't know when it was. It's one of your incel videos. You were talking to somebody, and I was like, oh shit, this dude's an incel? And like, and I started getting ideas. Well, a former incel, correct? I don't want to do that.
Yeah. At this point, it was kind of a joke, but I can't say that it was a joke because I said it so much. So I'll kind of own the fact that I kind of mislabeled it. But yeah, that was the correct.
Either way, that I don't know when that nebulous video is going to come up. I tend to plan things out, but I just, while I had you, I wanted to make sure you knew that we can exchange info before I bounce out of here and before all hell breaks loose. Maybe, I don't know.
Okay.
So yeah, that's what I got to start.
Okay, so
Also,
when you're
my kids just came. I'm gonna miss the. I don't know. Like, just pause for a second before you respond, because I don't want to miss what you're saying.
Okay, give him a minute. But that is an interesting question. That does capitalism require
Incels.
well a permanent underclass? And given that the structure was originally founded, right, on a very racist system in America, does it, as it, again, not speaking of the exceptions, but speaking in general, because we can point to exceptions to the rule here, Oprah being probably a very prominent, easily identifiable one. But when it comes to just in general, the permanent underclass, can we help black people escape from that without dismantling capitalism? And I'm curious what Ahrelevant would have to say once FD Signifier gets.
I'm back.
Okay, so then you're unleashed, Ahrelevant. Go ahead.
when we're talking about a permanent underclass, are we just referring to individuals in like poverty? Is that what we're referring to, or what are we referring to as an underclass?
The underclass is, I mean, it's a wide swath. It's mostly people without. We'll start with just people without access to capital, people without access to the means of production, people without access to self-determine how they're going to exist in the world here in the West.
So when you say without access, I'm assuming you mean without access to the point in which you can have that surplus labor result in you not being able to have to work outside of it. Because there is, as I brought up earlier, there's many individuals who have, technically everybody has access to it if you have money and you have a stock market account.
Quick point of information, surplus value, not surplus labor. Sorry, continue.
Sorry, surplus value, right? So I'm assuming we would remove the individuals with retirement accounts or 401ks with stocks put inside of or money put in stocks, correct? We would not assume any of those people, or would we?
Not necessarily. I mean, I had retirement before I started doing YouTube as a teacher. You know, I still existed as a black person experiencing racism, and in relatively modest means. So it's you can't just you're not going to be able to just kind of like perfectly define what poverty looks like, but you know the underclass based on their access to power.
So I personally, this was actually a bridge that I was going to share with President Sunday here. I actually agree that there is a separate idea here, but it's not necessarily about people who own these shares in a company that can enable them to be able to rake in dividends or profits to the point where in which they don't have to work, but it's the people who have the opportunity to be able to do that. So I take, for example, individuals who are making millions of dollars in income. These people have an indescribably different life than probably every person. I don't know exactly how much money FD Signifier makes. I don't think
Much
you're
less than
making,
everybody
like,
thinks.
I'm not sure you're making like 3 mil a year or something like that. That's like the
no.
threshold. Okay,
I
that's like
would
the
be
threshold
doing
for
much
it.
less videos. But yes.
So yeah, so that's kind of the threshold that I'm talking about, where at that point you are, like President Sunday referred to, you are choosing to work. At any point in time, you can take that money and you can put it in the market, and literally, I think at typical market rates, you'd be making like over $140,000 a year of passive income. Like that is just ridiculous, you know. At that point, and that I would say describes a different.
If I can
So
just
we're
amend that just a tiny quick bit. Not having to work is one defining element. Having negotiating power of a specific kind is another. The capitalist, for example, can refuse to purchase labor. The laborer cannot refuse to sell. They die under those conditions. Continue, please.
Sure. Okay, sure. So, if we're just taking that group of people and we're assuming everybody outside of that group is the underclass, then I would say that that underclass, there's always going to be a mix of people within that underclass. I don't understand, though, if we're describing that, I don't understand how that is something that is going to necessarily perpetuate racism. Because if with that being the purview, we could have like dozens of black people who are making significant amounts of money, or sorry, not dozens. We could have a tremendous amount of, like, a majority of black people making a tremendous amount of money who are still in the underclass, but like, how does that perpetuate racism any more than any other system?
Generally speaking, those folks end up being class traders. Jay-Z, Killer Mike, Oprah, and so on.
Yeah, I'm not referring to. Okay, I guess I don't understand how being in an underclass perpetuates racism in comparison to.
I'll tag in President Sunday.
Thank you. Bless you, sir. Pleasure to meet you, by the way. One of the ways it does is as a consequence of being in an exploited class, i.e. you have to trade, but the person you're trading with does not have to trade back, which puts you at a disadvantage, is that you accept a trade that is not equitable. And sometimes it is so inequitable that despite working your ass off, you remain in poverty, as many people do. And so if you have a group that has been slotted into the system as a disprivileged category of person in the community, that's going to replicate itself. Because now you have people who have been slotted in by a racist system into a part of an exploited class. And as a consequence of being as a part of that exploited class, they are under social conditions that hammer them in to poverty. The amount of stress, lack of nutrition, etc., that is begotten as a consequence of that is enormous. And that's why even under capitalism, even when formally there's total upward mobility in principle, there's not a law that says nobody can't ascend to any rank in society. Practically, it's impossible for most people. It's the very lucky few who actually make it up. Yeah.
So, I can agree with some of those ideas. However, the pushback that I have is that if we agree that these individuals are in this underclass, where is the... I guess I'm just not understanding. I agree with the idea that the poor people are going to tend to stay poor.
Yes.
Rich people are going to tend to stay rich and stuff like this. Could we not incorporate systems within capitalism, maybe even make it a mixed system that makes it easier for people who are in poverty to be able to actually have an equality, or as close as we can, equality of
presumably this is one of the premises of Marxism. So you don't have like a magical dissolution of capitalism. Instead, rather, you have the taking over of the means of production by organizations of workers, and so you have the exact same dynamic. However, you don't have two classes. That's one of the proposed solutions, and via that way you would eventually dissolve the distinction between those two classes. You wouldn't have individuals who exploit. No, go on, please.
Oh, what I'm referring to is a mixed system. So, like, my honestly, my biggest issue with socialism as a concept is the idea that there is no organization of a business that I can run where in which I can't just run it between me as a sole proprietor or between like me and my buddies. Right? That's my personal.
No. There's not a contradiction there. This
That's
is where
not
like
true.
basic. This is where basic political. I didn't mean to cut you off there. This is where basic political theory comes in handy, because you can have any organization, for example, that is democratically structured, nonetheless refer decisions to an executive body that is a minority within it. There's no contradiction there.
No,
I wanted to hear.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, FD
Signifier, why he had a strong. That's not true, and I want him to.
It's just not true that you can't run a business as a sole proprietor under socialism, or that you and your buddies, like that's you and your buddies running a business together was like the perfect, socialist bro imagination of how socialism could work. Is you and your boys get together and, I don't know, make hats or some shit, and you all democratically agree on how you're going to run that business. It's not a, so I mean there are versions. I think there's planned economies and stuff like that. I am not, my expertise is in race, so I don't know enough about the history of how planned economies have failed and succeeded. So I know that's a thing, but the idea that you can't just run a business for profit under socialism is just that's just not.
Can I add something to that very quickly, just to preempt confusion? When a business is run democratically, or when any entity is run democratically, all that means is that the source of the legitimacy of the deciding element within that organization is upstream from the generality, i.e. there is a vote, not just on every single decision. That's just a plebiscite. That's not democracy. There is a vote on who makes decisions as well. And so you can have a company capable of making unilateral decisions that is nonetheless democratically determined. This is in fact how all states work, and they can do things. Yes, please go on.
I guess if I'll let you finish, but then I have an interjection. So Ahrelevant, go, and then I have a question.
So the whole idea of me bringing that up is supposed to be not that you can't have a small group of people run a business, or that you can't start a business as a small group of people. It's that you can't stay as an individual making those unilateral decisions. It's that as you gain more employees, those people need bargaining power inside of that system. So like, let's say that I start my own business and I hire 100 people. Those people need to have a say in how that business is run in some kind of a democratic fashion under socialism. Whereas I think that if I'm putting significant amounts of my capital into this, I should be able to say how this thing is run. And I think there are other businesses that should be co-ops. I think there should be co-ops and traditionally run capitalist organizations, of course, with strong union or worker representation integrated within them.
I guess my question, to again try to tie this back to the topic at hand, is how a democratically controlled worker base is going to be any less racist. In fact, I would say that there is a large risk of it actually exacerbating
intrinsically
racism.
There's no reason to necessarily think that it would be. However, formally, a capitalist system has the perfect slot for that kind of discrimination and for that specific type of exploitation. In principle, you could have a capitalist system on the moon that is less racist than, I don't know, like a feudal system on Earth somewhere where there is a concept of race. The problem, though, is that given the presence of a racial categorization scheme that's sort of taken up, capitalism provides the absolute perfect avenue for that to inflect market outcomes and relationships between classes.
You keep mentioning this racial scheme, like this schematic of racism,
Yes.
the concept of race in general. I don't think that we can, at least now, I don't think that without dismantling that, and I think we can dismantle that either under capitalism or socialism, I don't think that matters. But as long as that concept exists in a socialist system, in a capitalist system, in any system you can think of, again, if you're doing things by democracy, by simple,
I agree, but here's the
vote,
catch. Here's the catch.
It's going to mean that the let me finish. That the majority, the people who there are more of them, are going to.
You've put your finger on something. You've put your finger on something, though.
Push
I want to
down against the people who are there less.
You've put your finger on something. You've put your finger on something very interesting. So, interestingly enough, the notion of race as we conceive it today owes its origin to relationships between classes in the French Revolution, because the nobility considered themselves to be above the bourgeoisie. Why? Because they were part of the conquering Germanic peoples who took over France, whereas the bourgeoisie and the commoners, they were the people who were conquered. And there was almost a good-natured right of the victor relationship until the French revolutionists won, and they fled to Germany and then started to identify as a cope, as part of a superior group that had been overrun by the slave classes, and so on and so forth. And so what you end up having is a situation in which it is precisely the distinction between classes under a capitalist system that makes the racial categorization as such feasible historically. At least that's how it played out in our history.
Well, we could look at other. Go ahead, FD. Please.
If I could jump in, the thing that we're dancing around is that racism is just really convenient for capitalism. Capitalism requires the underclass. And it's like, okay, who are we going to choose for this? We have a whole legacy of literally dehumanized people that the vast majority of the country, including many of them themselves, see as lesser and undeserving of pretty much any good things in general. And historically, and I want to be clear, like historically, is the irony, you know, because what's up, Brody? What you need? You quit. The irony, because when I first came, you know, Sunday wasn't here, and I'm not gonna like spark stuff with Sunday, but Sunday, I'm sure you're well aware that we tend to be on differing parts of we'll say ideological spaces on the air quotes online left.
Even enemies can show respect, friend. It's okay.
Yes, and even in that regard, right? That is historical. You know, historically, labor movements have excluded black people. That is, you know, there's been riots based around labor movements and unions being pointed at African Americans who crossed the line because they weren't allowed to join the unions. You know, so capitalism, it incentivizes the maintenance of that system. And as we get into late capitalism, it exacerbates that incentive. And so, like, you cannot just gloss over the fact that poverty looks a specific way here in America, and that the effects of that poverty lend itself to alienation, lend itself to anti-blackness, lend itself to people like literally, if you go to that same era in the post-industrial era, I'm probably going to fuck this up. The point I'm trying to lead to is coming out of the New Deal, Italians, Irish, so many different, what we now consider white people weren't considered white up until around that point. And it was the New Deal that helped pull them into that white status, specifically because it was like, hey, we can either fight the Negroes, the Irish, the Italians, etc. We can either fight all of them at the same time, or we could cut off one leg, cut off one section of this problem and isolate it to make it the whole of the thing that we use to fuel this machine. So, like, we can't just gloss over the reason. Either black people are all the underclass because there's something uniquely wrong with us, and I don't know if anyone's gonna abide by that conversation. And if you are, I'm gonna let you do that yourself.
Wick.
Or you have to recognize that there is a specific designated system of oppression that intertwines with capitalism to make that happen.
So I will recognize that there is a system that does intertwine with capitalism that does do that. That's not the question for me. The question is, would that system also not perpetuate itself if we had a different form of economic system? And I think it would. I think ultimately what is spurring on this specific situation is that you're right. People do. There is an underclass in this situation, but I think that's a social demand, not necessarily an economic demand. And yes, and in this case, there is an economic demand in capitalism to have that underclass. However, I think that social demand is there, and that's part of the reason why this underclass exists. I still think it would exist in a social.
I'm sorry, but even if that. even if I agreed that it was purely a social demand, which I don't,
Okay.
that social demand still will create economic consequences.
Correct. Yeah.
And reinforces everything else in the process. You know, the social demand for housing for black people had an economic response fueled by racism and redlining. The economic demand for housing 40 years later by I'm a video essayist, so I need to remember the names. Fucking Robert Moses building suburbs outside of the cities. That was a economic and city planning policy that had a explicitly racist manifestation. You know what I'm saying? So you can't separate these things. Like you can pull out one part or the other at a time to analyze and critique. But at the end of the day, once you put those things back into the equation, it's still an equation. You know, it's still one unified function of how capitalism uses racism to fuel itself, at least here in America.
Yeah, when we're talking about this, we're talking about groups of people, like small groups of people, that profit off of these systems to be able to perpetuate fear or animosity towards a minority group, in this case black people, right? That's what we're speaking on. But that still exists even under a socialist or more democratic scheme. You still have a profit to be able to do that. And when the majority of people, in my opinion, are like turning a blind eye to social issues that really especially don't affect them, if it makes them money, I think what we're going to have is not only now a bunch of people who are like, you know what, black people, I'm not too sure about these people, or whatever, and they also are now going to make a lot of money for turning a blind eye towards these injustices or inequalities, or even perpetuating them. You are paid actively more money for just going like, oh, fuck these people.
Sounds like my job.
On an individual basis. Yeah, I know, right? Like
That's just yeah. There's a lot of I guess this mirrors a lot of what happens, I think, online, where we are incentivized to screw each other over all the time. We are incentivized to make different people less than us in order for clicks, views, etc. I think whether that be a capitalist system or a socialist system or any other system, that is going to happen. And I don't know. I remain unconvinced, I should say, that capitalism uniquely and especially perpetuates this. But I wanted to give. I'll hear you out.
Oh, just very quickly. I'm not making a statement.
Then I want to hear.
Yeah, but I'm not making a statement though. I do have to leave. I have another obligation coming up.
Good luck.
Thank you for bringing me on, Wick. Good conversation, really. FD Signifier, hit me up sometime. Have a good night, everyone. Take care.
Beautiful. See you guys later.
Nice. That was about to turn into a shit show. I could see it coming. All right. Oh boy, I gotta run to the washroom. And we're gonna get into the actual thing that's on the title of the stream. I'll be right back, folks. One moment. think that was fun. That went well. That was actually a really good Wiki panel. This is the first time I'll ever say that. That was a good Wiki panel. I enjoyed that. Small meter? Well, you can't see my face if the meter's big. Don't you make the meter bigger? I like being able to gesticulate. Let's see, what's winning right now? Gentili's Doctrine of Fascism. Close second, Industrial Society and its Future. I'm disappointed that Feuerbach on Species Being isn't getting any love, but that's okay. I am grateful that there's no more maps of meaning. Although, I am talking to that P.F. Young person next week at some point, apparently, on maps of meaning. On its merits, as it were, so that'll be interesting. That was completely a target of opportunity. That wasn't planned. Apparently, the original two people who were going to be on Wick's stream, Aston Mac and Ninetails, they ditched. So the conversation was kind of painful. So I was like, "Hey, bring me on." And he did. You avoided Feuerbach? Well, yeah. Look. Us better people, we are few, sort of as a, by definition. Did you ever schedule a convo with an economics person? We have a debate on the 29th. We're going to be debating whether or not Marx is a Hegelian. Actually, no, not whether Marx is a Hegelian. It's going to be a little bit more specific than that. Whether Marx's proposed system or something was Hegelian in nature. By the way, 30 pages of Marx. You'll benefit so much from it. You know what else is really good? By the way, Capital is so much more than a book of economics. If you have not even, like, broached this at all, I have not read the whole thing. Dear God. Like, look at this thing. This is only volume 1, but so good. Marx is a fucking genius. Actually. You wouldn't know that. The problem is you need to know what questions Marx is asking. And if you approach it as something like what Milton Friedman would write, you're not going to get it. It's not a book of economics. It's a critique of our understanding of social structures as bodies in the first place. If you want to get like a really, really quick primer on Marx that's really solid, I think it's actually out of print, but the Marx Engels Reader, edited by Robert C. Tucker, so good. Coming back to this after having the hell is this? Coming back to this after having like gone through my political science degree and everything, and returning to a lot of these writings, I didn't appreciate Marx my first time round. He preempted so many modern theorists. The entirety of Max Weber's political theory is contained and critiqued in Marx, in his early writings, in his 20s. Like, the man was brilliant. There's no way around it. Absolutely brilliant. Which is horrifying, because you can be brilliant, better than all of your competitors, and you can still be demonized for centuries. It's going on. Terrifying. Available secondhand for like 12 US? I don't know about that. I bought this secondhand. This cost me like $40. This was not cheap. Maybe it's different in the States. I've heard Gotha Program was a nice read for Marx. You know what's surprisingly a nice read for Marx? On the Jewish question. That combined with his critiques of Hegel's philosophy of right, and he continues this in the Jewish question. By the way, there's a full Cambridge edition of Marx's critique of Hegel. I'm actually going to buy that at some point because I want to go through the whole thing. And that's this. Marx is the kind of person I can't read on PDF. I need to mark him up. So I need to put Marx on Marx. Kill me. How'd I do? How was that? How was that conversation, that panel? I thought that went surprisingly well. I was kind of surprised at myself. It's my first dip into that area. You found a copy for about $20. Lucky bastard. I also recommend Anti-Düring by Engels. This has sections of Anti-Düring. Let me see how much it actually has. But the supplementary materials in this, like the introduction, is fantastic. It's a lucidly, clear, and concisely written history of Marx's intellectual development. This volume is worth its weight in gold. It's so good. I'm getting so much from this. It only confirmed my position on Marx and Hegel to begin with, but let's see. Because it goes until Marx's death, which will be the end of Capital, of his last book. Actually, hang on. Is it his last book? Let's see the chronology here. Civil War in France. Looks like the Civil War in France was his last writing. Because only Capital Volume 1 was published in Marx's lifetime. Capital's Volume 2 and 3 were published by Engels. Sort of assembled from his notes. They were more or less complete, but they weren't like in their final authorized form, I suppose. You own the libs, no cap? Thank you, Lisa. I appreciate that. Kind of want to talk to you about Marxism at some point. I will accommodate that at some point. Anti-Düring is so good, it's entertaining as fuck because Engels dunking on Düring, and it's super informative. By the way, for anybody who's new here, or for anybody who hasn't been paying attention, who wasn't in the last stream, I've got a new approach to the theory meter, which is over here. Your donations will carry over to next stream. I'm also contemplating allowing people to super chat back to drama. However, there's a catch. There's a rub, rather. If we meet $100, because I want to do the theory stuff. This is the stuff that makes me like running this channel. If we hit $100, even if somebody counteracts it and we go back to drama, I'll probably set the rate at $100. If somebody does that, I'll do theory the next stream. No charge. I think that's fair. I think it's very fair. The theory streams, I love them. I benefit from them intellectually. They're so exhausting. I have respiratory issues reading that stuff for so long. Oh my god, I am done at the end of those streams. But I love them. Doe recommended one, actually. We're going to be doing, I'm going to put Omelas. Those Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula K. Le Guin. It wanted us to put that up as an option to go over at some point. I may go over it anyways. Maybe I'll invite Doe on. We'll see if it wants to join. That'd be fun. It's so weird, the conversation today, because you know what I was doing last night, just on a lark? I was listening to Jack Angstreich debate Academic Agent on Marx's labor theory of value. What are the odds? Serendipity. We need ranked choice voting. What are you, a liberal? The theory meter has changed. It has. Look at this thing. Look how beautiful this is. Look at this. It's actually fully animated. That squid is moving. Thank you, Rick Sire, for the $1.99. Appreciate that. Who made it? I did. You want to know how I made it? It's so stupid. So I drew the squid in MS Paint. I drew the tank in MS Paint. I put them into Corel. I put a bunch of filters on them to make it look more organic. I put the squid with no background, because using a browser-based background remover, because I don't know how any of this works. I put that into Power Director, which is the editor I use, which is surprisingly competent. I put a few filters on it to make it kind of drift a little bit, and make it look kind of watery, added bubbles. And then I did the exact same thing with the tank image. And then I overlaid the 2 videos of the squid and the tank so that the squid was a little bit transparent and the tank was more transparent. Put those on top of each other, process into a single video, and then I did the exact same thing with the liquid. Drew a bunch of squiggles in MS Paint with the brush tool, put it into Corel, made it more organic looking, more squishy, made it move about in PowerPoint, and uploaded that as a video with the edges trimmed. So the squid meter thing, like that tank, it actually covers the whole screen. Just a big black screen. It's so dumb. That wasn't beer. Alright. Well, anywho. We've got a thing we're supposedly going over. Palm Dad, thank you for the $3. Feed the squid. We will. We will. We're close. We're actually... Oh, we're not close. We're not close at all. Where are we at right now? We are at $18. So we need about 80 more. About 80 more dollars, and we go straight into theory. But maybe you won't want to. Maybe this will be too much fun. Let's see. Oh, somebody on your friend request. Who's this? Oh, Ahrelevant. Nice. We're now friends with Relly. Relly was not a terrible interlocutor. He would benefit from reading like 20 goddamn pages of Capital, but... I didn't hate that conversation. I think he's gotten better since his Doe debate. Alright, let's get to work. Turn this off. Now, oddly enough, we are, we're watching a Food Shops video. Remember that person? So odd. So odd. But seems like a decent person, all things considered. But odd. So she, assuming it's she confronted notsoErudite on her quote-unquote shaky moral framework. Let's put us up here. Let's make us a little bigger. Make the theory bar a little smaller. And we'll pull up food stamps. Alright. Apparently perspective philosophy makes an appearance in this. Color me intrigued. Well, we're not getting any younger. Let's... Once more into the breach, dear friends.
Wait. So God tells you what is good and what is bad.
What is she holding?
So God determines what is good and what is bad.
But then you don't know what...
Hang on, I need to call Food Shops. I need to ask what book she's holding. Hey, quick question for you. What book are you holding in the introduction to your video?
Wait, what? What book am I holding?
Yeah.
Is it a blue book?
Can't tell. The one in the Erudite video.
If it's a blue... Okay, hold on. I'm gonna...
You're on stream, by the way. Sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier.
Oh, don't worry. I'm also on stream.
Swell.
Okay, hold on.
Content stealing.
So, don't worry. We're content...
You're content stealing my content stealing.
Yeah, I am. We're content stealing. You're content stealing. You're content stealing. Okay, hold on. By the way, I always enjoy hearing your voice. Okay, hold on. So,
thank you.
I mean, if you're talking about this book.
Oh, the Quran. Okay. Oh, that's the. I know that one. They assigned it at my college a long time ago.
Oh yeah, this is the Quran that one of my former reviewers that dropped in more often. Does like he's a Taliban member. And yeah,
what?
yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
continue.
yeah, he's a Taliban member, and he says that this is the only version of the Quran he accepts, and then he says, "Oh yeah, buy this," and he's like,
In English?
in
That
English,
doesn't
yes,
sound
there's
like
the
a
English.
that doesn't sound like a very Taliban-y attitude at all.
Well, I mean, he says that like if he accepts any kind of English translation, this is the only version that he accepts.
Fair enough. Okay.
Yeah. And then yeah, he's a Taliban. He says that ISIS like is way too like non-progress, basically. Anyway, other than that, this is a notebook. This is the notebook that I use for debates. And yeah, whenever I write down things, oh dude, oh yeah, this is like full of things like against Lauren de Laguna, against Destiny, against whatever. So I write everything in here for debates. And this is my stopwatch whenever I need to keep track of time. Whenever
I
people
got one
talk
of those.
for too long. Yeah.
I got a new one actually. I'm actually
yeah,
really pleased with this one.
Yeah, and here is. I'm just kidding. I actually use the online debate, whatever. I actually just use this for aesthetic. Okay. And then here, just kidding. I don't even use the online stopwatch. I use my intuition. Okay. So here is the. Yeah. So here is I don't even know. I don't even use this notebook. Anyway, that's it. That's all the books I have.
You got more than that. But we'll chat about that later. I'm going to run to your video now. If you want to chat afterwards, be my guest, okay?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Right.
Okay. We're gonna watch your reaction on stream now, okay? Alright, see ya.
All right,
Bye.
see you in a bit. Oh, she's so weird. Okay.
What God is saying, did I get that correctly?
Hold on, can I answer fully for you for a second? I would like to have a conversation with you because it sounds like so the context that I tend to look at would be like the culture and the time and like the scientific and philosophical knowledge available at the time of like a moral decision being made.
So if you died and you went to the afterlife and you end up in hell,
At some point you go, well, reducing harm is good. Well, why is it good? It's good because it reduces harm. And goodness is reducing harm because
is a bot.
reducing harm is good.
Rezi, you said you had questions for notsoErudite's. I'll let you ask your questions first about the...
What do you mean? Guy, I'm
This
literally
video is so loud. Let's turn down a bit.
hopping onto this because it's like, oh, religion
That's what you
channel?
said! You said I don't
No,
understand
I
what
just
it
don't
is
know-
that she
I don't
believes,
know.
and so I wanted to know, and so I said that you could ask the questions first, but if you don't want to ask your freaking questions, then...
Do you want me to like? Do you
Nobody-
have questions you want to ask, and you want me to like?
I
kinda
have
guide
a
this, or
million
what's up?
questions. I have a million questions,
Okay.
but if you want, you said that you didn't know what it was that you
I just
believed on
I just
couple of
want to get
specific
like a
things.
basic.
So if you wanted to ask those questions,
understanding.
that's fine. You can ask those
Okay, cool.
questions. But if you don't want to, if you want to leave, you can go home.
I'm already home, but sure, absolutely. Hi, Erudite.
Hey,
Came on here to it's just Tom's Tuesday panel. Had some free time, so I had to pop on. Didn't realize that we were going to be talking about religion through this lens of, I believe, your statements
Hold
on
on.
free will.
Kid not kin. Do you have a camera, sir?
What?
Are you?
I was just
No.
watching
Oh,
your
you're on
video.
a phone.
Oh, Kidnockin.
Never mind.
I like Kidnockin.
I'm on a phone. Yeah. Wait, you're watching my video?
Yeah, I was starting to watch your video
I used to not, but I like him now.
on FD Signifier, and then I was like, I should probably hop on Tom's show and why not?
Oh, cool. Nice.
What was the video on?
It's like the FD Signifier one. He posted it like 13 hours ago.
Oh, yes.
FD
I saw
Signifier
that.
criticizes Shuan Head's attempt at saving men.
So I wanted to ask. Okay, so I saw you on the panel with what's it called? BPF.
and
Okay.
them.
Thor.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So, because I was talking to Sprouticus about this earlier as well. You said
Yeah.
that because I just recently left religion, just within the last like 6 months. I stopped calling myself a Christian.
Heresy!
But to me, like, because God says this is the way it is, and like this is what is right or wrong, it seems objectively that entails an objective morality as well, and that even just not being a Christian in and of itself would be a sin, and therefore, like, you're not doing the right thing. But I thought you were saying that that people are only judged based on the morality that they that they believe in, and that people are only doing.
Not exactly. So there are verses in the Bible, in the New Testament specifically, to the effect that you are judged by the law that you know. That does not mean, however, that you are sin-free if you don't onboard a Christian ethic, because there's also a thesis, and you can contest this. Indeed, I would probably contest most of the New Testament, but you can contest this. There's a thesis in the New Testament that the law of God at a certain basic level is written on the hearts of even the Gentiles, and so therefore you're still able to be judged despite not having heard the good news, so to speak. So that's not correct. It's not correct that you are judged according to your belief system. It's a little bit more subtle than that.
Something immoral based on their own ethical system.
Not quite. That's moral subjectivism. I don't believe in moral subjectivism.
Okay,
I'm a
good.
moral relativist. Like, really simply,
You're a moral relativist? You can't be a Christian and a moral relativist. That makes no sense. You have God ratifying a particular set of commandments.
I'm a moral relativist.
Can you explain that?
As a Christian. What
I like
moral
her.
relativism is?
Yeah, I don't quite know what
specifically,
that means. Yeah.
Oh, she's smart. She knows exactly what that means.
Sure, yeah. So basically, there's different types of relativism. So
I'm going to be honest. I didn't like Food Shops initially. She's very weird, very off-putting. She's clever, though. That's my general read right now. She's devious.
one would be like individual. That's more close to like subjectivism. I'd be more of like a cultural relativist. So basically, I judge what is like moral or immoral based on some level of context. So it's all like relative, essentially. So the context that I tend to look at would be like the culture and the time and like the scientific and philosophical knowledge available at the time of like a moral decision being made. So like if
do you
I
have,
talk
so
about morality of
if
a
I
North
may,
American
right?
person-
Right. So in the past, if people's lifespans were shorter, you can justify, for example, you can arguably justify procreating at a younger age than 18 for because of like moral relativism, right?
I suppose. I mean, you could use multiple
Like
moral
that.
systems probably to
You,
make that
yeah,
argument.
right. But you would be using something like moral relativism as like a concept with your moral framework to justify something like that, right?
Yeah, I guess like if it's required, there'd be like a lot of context I would need before I would answer that, and there's probably like an age cap that I think we would always.
Okay, I've heard. Yeah, I've heard that argument before from a Taliban sympathizer. So yeah, that's what. I
Yeah,
heard
it could be relativism could be used to justify that.
How is she off-putting? Because if you're not familiar with her, she seems very erratic and kind of like she's clever though.
That, yeah.
So that means that like slavers back when slavery was legal and in a social norm that they weren't necessarily doing.
How is she a Christian? Probably she was raised as one. She was involved. The organization she got her license as an addictions counselor in was a religious organization, so it probably was just like natural to her. Like I come from a Christian background. If I didn't go to university and I didn't like pay attention to stuff and I didn't bother to think about it, I probably would have remained identifying simply as a Christian. I still do in a certain very specific way, but I don't call myself one openly for the simple reason that it bears content that other people will attach to me that's not accurate. Same with erudite, I expect. The difference is that erudite, unlike me, doesn't seem to be all that concerned about how people understand her loyalties or her credentials.
Anything moral because that was relative to the time that they were in. Yeah.
It depends. It depends. So my moral system is going to be based kind of like I would test people on 4 things. So that person's beliefs, that person's
Sunday calling women devious, what does the world come to? I'll call devious women devious all the time. They can be as devious as men can. Like, not so erudite's not devious. She's gormless. Food shops, she's devious. She's clever. There's a wit under the facade.
belief system, the beliefs, the like standards of the society that they exist within, and then I would compare it to like my society standards if I'm dissatisfied with that. So the slave owner could be morally neutral or could be immoral depending on all of those things. It would really depend.
Would you
Like, was it
would you
reasonable for them to
distinguish
think it was
this?
okay?
Would you distinguish this from a sort of a non-cognitivist position, where that there is no objective moral fact whatsoever, that really
Yeah,
you're just
because-
abiding by the cultural standards of what is the classic, the murder boo, like just like when you're saying something is wrong, you're basically just saying that you don't like that thing.
Well, most people
Right,
don't think
so,
about
like-
it. Yeah.
Relative is more oppositional to absolutism than it is to something like objectivism. right? So like the opposite to objective is subjective, whereas the opposite to absolute is relative. So relative is just varying the circumstances. You can use relativism to basically vary it to the point where like you can be like a non-cognitivist, like you said, but I'm not.
Relativism is varying the frameworks and treating them as equivalent along sort of a, like it's mapping them as opposed to ranking them on a scale.
Non-cognitivist person.
Okay, because I feel like the distinction there would be like, if you're a moral relativist, then you can say like for a fact that like in this particular.
But does Sunday think she's hot? Nah, not my type. No character, too vanilla.
Context, this particular.
It's not an objective judgment. I'm just saying. Boring as hell, in my humble opinion.
Thing is good or bad, based on the culture and the environment around them. It is objectively good or bad to that context.
Right. So like relativism can be a moral realist or a moral anti-realist, right? Because moral relativism is a massive, massive branch of.
Also female, but I digress.
I'm just a little bit curious, right? So what is the difference between relativist and like subjectivist, right? Like, because when you're talking about like these two concepts, like what is one specific example in our society right now where it would be allowed under one but not allowed under the other, or something like that, like under your framework? I'm just curious, like an actual real world example.
Sure, I want to make sure
She's the hottest one on the panel, but food shops and Kidnotkin are present, so clearly not.
Understanding your question first, though, just because like these words have sometimes really specific meanings, but I think when most people talk about it, they're probably not using the precise like philosophical, which is not like a condemnation by any means. I think the first issue I ran into is that I wasn't.
You hate this? Me too.
Being super precise about.
You missed the. We had a really good conversation earlier, Brooks. You missed the good part of the stream.
My language, so that's.
Unless you all fill the theory meter, in which case the good part of the stream is yet to come. We are only 80 away from being able to. What are we looking through first? This is the these are the theory meter options as they are ranked. Gentili's Doctrine of Fascism at 34% of the vote. Industrial Society and its feature by Ted Kaczynski at 29% of the vote. More Maps of Meaning, God Knows Why at 20% of the vote. And Feuerbach on Species being my personal choice at 17% of the vote. I hate you all.
That's the main reason I'm being
so relativist is depending on scenario, time, and
or do they say not the hottest? Well, fair enough then.
Culture, right?
It could be multiple. So a relativist just basically is the view that moral judgments are true or false only relative to some particular standpoint.
Oh, okay. Some subjective standpoint, you said?
Some relative
standpoint.
It's only relative to some particular standpoint.
Okay. And how would you define a moral subjectivist?
Oh man, I guess let me pull that one up. I don't have that one.
It's going to be subjective to the individual at hand. Like there is no actual
Usually,
moral truth to be found. It's just going to be based on what the individual person thinks is good or bad. So like not within the context of the culture or the
decided by the individual,
community that they're in. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And I'm like a moral realist brand of relativist.
Yeah, I'm very much the moral anti-realist, non-cognitive.
Moral realist brand of relativist, what? That doesn't make any sense.
This position.
Right, yeah, that's what you and I when we were both really drunk at TwitchCon.
All that would mean... An anti-realist is a moral relativist. That's like a Kantian approach. Under those circumstances, you would just make the moral something that sort of stands above cultural differences, and then make sort of an orientation toward the good in a more general sense. That would be what defines the moral versus the immoral, at least as far as humans are capable. That'd be my read on that. Whatever.
Talking about.
Oh my god, don't even remind me. I barely even
But that's not relativism. That's cultural relativism, not moral relativism.
remember, okay? That's embarrassing.
You were being like, yeah, but everything's subjective. And I was like, nah, man, there's some things that are real. And we were having like a very meta-ethical
If I wasn't drunk, okay? If I wasn't drunk, you would have been in trouble.
I would have. I probably would have, especially back then, because I was just like, I'm still a little fledgling in philosophy, so.
So not so erudite.
I'm sure. Sure. Yeah.
Why is it that you don't prescribe yourself to moral subjectivist but to relativist?
Because I believe in like a moral reality. I think that there are things that are like true, basically.
Do you believe that
Like there are rights and wrongs, concretely, and can be, like,
concretely?
that are
Concretely?
What is
What does that mean concretely? They're going to be in the abstract or above the concrete, no? Concrete? Like there's... You know what concrete means, right? Concrete means... that this is concrete. That's concrete, okay? I think she means fixed.
is a right and a wrong concrete in your opinion?
So like what I mean by concretely means like given all of the information,
Directionally, exactly.
there can be known to some degree a right and a wrong concretely.
Right.
And this is because specifically I'm
They can be
religious, right?
known concretely? How? Where in the stars do you find the answer to moral quandaries written? That doesn't make any sense, Kyla.
If I wasn't religious, I think it would be really hard to have this standpoint.
Right, but you said
No, it's really hard to have this standpoint regardless of who you are. Kant was a Lutheran.
concretely, right? Like
Yeah, because I think
it's
God
set
knows
in.
exactly what is right and wrong at all times. The problem is that doesn't mean I know what God thinks is right and wrong. They're not always accessible.
But the confusion
Wait.
that I would have is why God would have a distinction between your location and culture as to what is right and wrong for you.
God hates liars in the Bible, by the way. You should correct the record on your credentials, Kyla, a bit more carefully and a bit more overtly, because you've been lying about them for a longo time.
So I'm going to give you the lame answer, which is the tautology, which is
Oh,
because
no.
God said. Yeah, because God said so.
Yeah.
God can do whatever he wants,
Yeah.
right? That's the axiom, right? That's the tautology. That is because
Yeah.
that is biblically though. I can give you biblical reasons. It's also baked into Christianity. It is like inherent. In fact,
What?
Protestants are weird. Protestants are the only ones that have like this really dogmatic view of ethics, whereas like Catholics
Right.
and Eastern Orthodox are not like this.
Thank you, Win, for the $5. Concrete is made of aggregates, cement, and water. I think the term concrete predates the existence of cement, but thank you nonetheless. We are on our way, friends.
Yeah, I mean, because like ultimately
To
the
greener, brainier pastures.
problem that Christians would end up facing is that why is it that if it was the case that like you basically had to subscribe to the particular like branch of Christian morality to be seen as a moral subject whatsoever, then the question then would be, why is God biased to people of particular areas? That why is it that the Europeans are significantly more morally
Hennessy's philosophy, notsoErudite's philosophy, is non-cognitivist, but not in the usual sense.
valuable than like anyone in Asia, basically?
I guess the framing is something that I maybe would disagree with about moral value necessarily. What I would talk about, at least what we're talking about here, would be like people have had the issue where I say like this might be a rule for me, but not for thee, right? As a religious person, the Lena the plug issue. That was where like a lot of this stemmed from. And so the issue is that what is sin biblically seems to be a lot more connected to what you know, right? So this is why, for example, when like the Jews
It's intrinsically connected to what you know. That's why like in Christian theology, it's the knowledge of good and evil that condemns you. It's the knowledge of the law that condemns you. However, there's a crucial line in one of the letters of Paul, which I believe is in, let me see, it's been a hot minute. It's crazy how fast you lose stuff. Oh! I think I found it. Bear with me. There's a Corinthians? I could just look this up, but I like the idea of handling physical books bound in leather just too much. Here, let's see. It's got to be a guy. By the way, this Revised Standard version of the Bible by Ignatius Press, the Second Catholic Edition, is gorgeous. You have no idea. Like the end covers, it's like a fabric. Like it's just paper, but it's been embossed in such a way as it feels like a fabric. And like the pages have like this gorgeous sort of cream coloring to them. The maps aren't anything to write home about. It's got two, but it's just so nice. Oh my god. It's not expensive either. I think it was like $40. For what it is. There are definitely more expensive ones. Okay. I'm going to look for 5 more seconds, then I'm going to give up, and I'm going to Google it. Gonna Google it. Not worth the time. Okay. So. Law of God written upon their hearts. This is kind of, Hebrews. Oh my god, really? Okay. Hebrews 8:10. I wasn't even close. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And then, it was in Romans. And then in Romans 2:14, even Gentiles, there we go, that's what I was looking for. Even Gentiles who do not have God's written law show that they know his law when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written in their hearts for their own conscience and thoughts, either accuse them or tell them they are doing right. This is one of the bases of natural law doctrine. International law.
In the story where the Jews are killing Jesus, right? Like, arguably, like, one of the worst sins.
Sunday, what do you think is a good Carl Schmitt book to start with? In my humble opinion, I think you'll get the most out of Nomos of the Earth, but if you're looking for something short that encapsulates a lot of his concepts, the concept of the political, this one here, this orange one, you could do worse. However, if you're going to buy this, I would just get Nomos of the Earth. This is most of what's in this you will get from Nomos of the Earth. The Nomos of the Earth is this beautiful thing. Best text by a Nazi ever. I'm running to the washroom. I'll be right back. Let's hop back to it.
It's like they're literally killing God. That's kind of bad. He says, "Forgive them, God. They don't know what they do," which is a pretty major shift of like understanding about like knowledge, especially because you have to understand with Jesus, we've got this new covenant that's coming in specifically. Another example is going to be coming from like Matthew 19:8, for example, where they're basically the Pharisees are trying to like trick him, and they're having this. I won't get into all the context because there's a lot kind of culturally and historically going on, but they're talking about divorce, and they basically ask them, "Can you divorce?" The Pharisees asked Jesus, "Can you divorce your wife?" And Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. This was not the way from the beginning." Essentially saying, before it was okay because of the context that you're in, but now we're saying it's not okay. So like, if you go through the Bible, there is, I mean, we could talk about the Bible in and of itself because like I'm not sola scriptura. That's another issue that people are going to run into with me. I'm not sola scriptura.
Wait.
So
That's what I was waiting to
No,
ask
there's
you
also-
about.
you
Because
could also ask-
obviously you're not sola scriptura, but I don't understand,
Obviously.
like, because I did grow up Protestant, so I'm wondering why. Because for me, why would we get the Bible if this is supposed to be like our message from God to like explain to us so that we all understand these things? Why wouldn't we take that literally and have that as the message when like even Jesus was fairly clear that like the church and church leaders can be corrupt and can use religion in a blasphemous way. Like, why wouldn't we have why wouldn't we have the text to know when that is or isn't happening?
So I would answer this in two ways. Number one, the writers didn't intend it literally, especially the Old Testament. When you read the Old Testament and you apply a sola scriptura fundamentalist lens to it, you're inherently reading it incorrectly. This is why Catholics and Eastern Orthodox considers like sola scriptura as like the fundamental heresy of heresies for Protestants. I think all heresies of Protestantism comes from sola scriptura. It's really, really interesting to read. There's an Orthodox scholar, I can't remember his name right now, but he writes a bunch about the heresy of heresies that Protestants have. Again,
Wait,
sorry.
here's
What's
another
what's the justification?
Sola Scriptura is heresy of heresies. What? No, it's the heresy within Protestantism that begets all other heresies. That's the language. Who is that? Let's see. I mean, sola scriptura is insane. It's committing yourself to a looping circular argument, but it's. Let's see. Okay, who said that? Heresy of heresies. Who said that? Anyways.
For assuming that the writer's intent was to be...
Like, I found a website that says the heresy which begets all other heresies, but I'm not finding a quote. Not denying that she has a citation there, I just don't know what it is. Was it Irenaeus? I don't know.
Subjective.
okay, because of all of our understandings about how writings occurred in Eastern historical tradition. Because it's especially the Old Testament, it's an Eastern book. It's an Eastern history book. And so when we look at the way that Eastern history was written, they were always mythological in nature, right? They would tell stories that somewhat mapped onto the people's history, but the stories were more important for imparting meaning to the people that were here.
Hang on, I need to hear that again.
What's the justification for assuming that the writer's intent was to be subjective?
Okay, because of all of our understandings about how writings occurred in Eastern historical tradition. Because it's especially the Old Testament, it's an Eastern book. It's an Eastern history book. And so when we look at the way that Eastern history was written, they were always mythological in nature, right? They would tell stories that somewhat mapped onto the people's history, but the stories were more important for imparting meaning to the people that were hearing it than they were important about like being didactic. So like most ancient
That is being didactic, though. Imparting meaning on the people is teaching them norms and mores and how to behave. That's what didactic means. You mean they weren't of academic interest? When the book of Genesis was written, they weren't concerned with providing a scientific textbook giving an explanation of the natural history of the earth. Fair, but
ancient Eastern writings, when we read them, we can pull little bits about the culture out from it, but like nobody reads like tons of like writings that we would call like fiction and go like, yeah, literally Achilles was like dipped by the gods and stuff like that. But we can learn things like,
well, they did read it that way, actually. People did, and they didn't read it, by the way. It was oral until relatively late in Greek history. Moreover, like a lot of these texts, hang on, let me double check something quickly. Oh, I got the hiccups, damn it. Oh, excuse me. That's gross. Okay. Old Testament. Writing year. Yeah, between 1500 and 400 BC. Oldest surviving Hebrew Bible manuscripts date to about the 2nd century BC. That's manuscripts, though. It's not the composition.
arate, and like what arate meant to the Greeks and how that's embodied.
Oh, hang on. What? Arate means excellence, by the way.
Nobody
Like a skillfulness or a perfection of an ability. That's your arate.
reads like tons of like writings that we would call like fiction and go like, yeah, literally Achilles was like dipped by the gods and stuff like that. But we can learn things like arate and like what arate meant to the Greeks and how that's embodied in Achilles. And we can also learn about like lots of the material that they're talking about, like the weaponry and stuff like that, is pretty actually accurate historically. But it's not didactic history, and most of Eastern writings are mythological history. That's how they used to write history.
Mythological history, that's how they... No, here's how they used to write history, okay? The word history comes from the Greek historia, and it refers to an inquiry. And so Herodotus begins his histories with this sentence. Here are presented the results of the inquiry carried out by Herodotus of Halicarnassus. So when we're talking about history, we're not talking about just an account. We're talking about the products of an investigation or an inquiry. And so history, as opposed to other forms of writing, it's not simply an account of the past. It's an account of the past that is the result of a specific individual investigating the past. It's not merely a chronology. It's the chronology that is the product of an investigation. It's a scientific inquiry into the past, if you will. They didn't used to write history that way. I'm not being pedantic, this is actually important. They didn't used to write history that way. They didn't have a tradition of critical scrutiny of past documents. And so what happened was not they wrote history in a mythological key. What happened was they took these things naively. So to treat it as if you can simply retain the content of it while treating it metaphorically, that involves some massive assumptions about the sort of transcendent validity of these stories' didactic value, which is precisely what they're written for. They were intrinsically didactic. Because why? Well, they weren't writing history for a university. They were writing and conveying it specifically because it was important to their culture, not understood as their culture. That's looking at it from the outside, but because they were viewed as sacred, because it tracked the special, unique place of their people and restated their identity for them, told them what they had to do, what they had to think, how they had to behave with respect to each other, that kind of thing. It's definitionally didactic. I don't know. It's weird that she doesn't understand that word. Didactic just means pertaining to teaching. Anyways.
So, like, how would you? So, I find this really, really interesting. I've recently been really interested in Kierkegaard, just because I'm very Nietzschean, and Kierkegaard basically takes like the other alternative.
I still have to read Kierkegaard. I haven't read any Kierkegaard.
Like, Nietzsche is.
It's one of the few books on my shelf I haven't read, actually.
Like, since Darwin, we basically have to just give up all of the like moral understandings that we have and where our values come from. And then Kierkegaard takes the other position of like, listen, there's no objective way to say which choice you take between abandoning all of that and living like an aesthetic life versus living a life of absolute faith and in the text of the Bible. And I find this really, really interesting. But if you're talking about the way that the Bible was written with this like mythological like bent to it, how is it that like we can assume that like the mythological bent to it didn't have its own purpose in regards to like the Nietzschean understanding of the situation would be that like the Christians had to invent their own God to have salvation from their like servitude, but that was something that was like historically and culturally significant of like they had to create their own values in this situation. So in a historical standpoint where you have like a people that have like a necessity of creating their own values, how can we just assume that like as this happens there's some sort of like a rational justification that links back to an understanding of God?
Is the question simply, and sorry if this is super reductive, I just want to make sure I'm understanding you.
Yeah, no,
is the
that's
question simply, if you're saying that the book, specifically when I'm saying mythological, I'm saying the Old Testament specifically, the New Testament is actually more Western writings, and we can talk about why I'm not sola scriptura with the New Testament as well. But
I just want to be clear real quick, just so that there's no confusion. So earlier we started talking about the religious and like objective morality and stuff, and I said I wanted everybody to hold off for a little bit because I was like, I do want to ask Not So Erudite about a bunch of this stuff, but if the topic's worn out by then, and then we go back to it after moving on to another topic, I was like, I don't want to do that. So I don't want other people to think like I meant for this to be like, you guys aren't allowed to have positions and like it's an argument with just Not So Erudite or something.
We're just interviewing Not So Erudite.
Yes, and that's fine. Like if everybody's cool with that, that's fine. I just wanted to make sure that like you guys understood that I just wanted to like wait for her to have the argument.
Sure.
Not
I'm killing
yeah.
it.
Sorry.
I just want. Listen.
No,
I want
but you're
Erudite
cool.
to-
Okay,
You're
okay,
cool.
okay.
Do your thing.
So
it's all good.
Shut up, Tom.
So from my
Wait.
I just want to say real quick.
Wait.
Here's a question
Okay,
posed.
you
Here's a
guys
question
interrupted
posed.
Erudite. I was
Here's a
waiting
question
patiently for an
posed.
answer.
Sure. Yeah, but I go after. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wasn't waiting.
Sorry, Kylie. Go ahead.
Wait, what?
Kid,
There's a
what was the
lineup.
question? Sus, kid,
Proud
what was
Eclipse
the
is saying-
question you asked?
Well, Kyla was in the middle of
I was
answering the
clarifying.
question when I
Yeah,
interrupted.
I was
and
clarifying
so,
his
I wanted to
question.
let her finish.
I was just basically saying, is your question basically, if you're saying this is mythologized, couldn't your God just be like mythologized bullshit? Is that basically what you're saying? Like, why do you believe in this big?
Yeah,
devil
I'm
monster
saying
in the
like, what's the
sky?
justification of knowing where that mythology starts and stops?
Yes. So the issue is that both of these things.
So the issue is genre. So how do you determine when the ancient mythologized history, as Erudite puts it, has transferred into a more definitive statement that has applicability outside of, a fable?
Can be true, because the problem with the spaghetti monster in the sky is it's necessarily unfalsifiable. This is the big problem, right? This is why it's a leap of faith. This is why when people are like, I think it's ridiculous, I'm like, okay. There's okay.
No, the problem with whatever. The spaghetti monster is a stupid comparison.
That's why.
Right?
That's why I was saying that I think Kierkegaard is really interesting in this discussion because of that necessity of having that leap of faith. But I'm questioning whether or not like you think that like that leap of faith is absolutely justified given the historical context.
So the issue is that my leap of faith is going to be like this deeply personal thing. Where basically, like, I talked to Wicked Supreme about this a while ago, and he was like, I just feel like you're a smart person. There's no reason you should be a Christian.
Yeah, but it's Wicked Supreme, so he would feel like you're a smart person.
Wait.
And I was like, fair enough. Hold on. And basically what I said is, when it comes to me and my personal faith, I've had too many things that keep happening in my faith in relation to like my spiritual experience with God, that it doesn't seem reasonable to not believe in
Like
God.
your encounter with the devil.
And like, this is why when people are like, well, I've had these experiences and that's why I don't believe in God, I'm like, that's super fair. This is like the unfalsifiable personal stuff. And so the issue is that because it's the unfalsifiable, I can have an answer for you that won't be satisfying, which would basically say it can be true that early Christians and Jewish people were making up facts and ideas and theology to justify what they needed to do, and that Yahweh was real and working through them and helping them, like what they needed to do was
Right.
somewhat.
Okay.
But why would you think so if your sole source for the existence of Yahweh is a text that you've already conceded is written by people who are making things up? That doesn't make any sense, and even I don't think Erudite is stupid enough to buy that, so I think she's being disingenuous.
Yeah, can I go? Can I,
Divine by him, blah 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 blah.
Wait,
Yeah,
wait, before
sure,
you go,
yeah, yeah.
before you go, please. Okay. Okay, finally.
You're good?
Okay, all right. So,
You
so I'm good. So I just have a question because I sort of want to steer away from all of this like Eastern, whatever,
bless you.
Bible quotes and stuff like that, because I don't really have all this funnel. When I was invited onto this panel, I didn't even know what the subject was, so I'm sort of trying to improvise right now, right? But my kind of, I'm still trying to understand what your position is on like this thing, and I still can't quite figure out what the difference between your difference, at least between moral relativism and moral subjectivity, and I want you to be able to explain it in a way without quoting like this kind of history behind it, or without this kind of whatever. And I think I asked you earlier for an example in real life where you would apply it in different ways between these two, where I can see the difference between these two without referring to like the scripture or whatever like that, right? But yeah, I was just curious about that. But the second part is that if now going back into the scripture just slightly, right? You know, from a commoner's perspective, right? Who's agnostic, doesn't believe in God, right? Whatever. What does God exactly tell you then? Because I would say, like, a lot of people would say, oh, God tells me the objective morals of the truths of the world. But if God doesn't tell you the objective truths because you're not like a moral objectivist, right? Or maybe God tells you some degree of objective truths, but you interpret them in a relative way. But I still don't quite understand that exact point. So I was wondering if you can answer these two questions.
That's a good question, actually. What's the epistemological value of God if you're taking a relative stance anyways? And if you've acknowledged that the sources for God's interjections into human history are the product of people who may have been making things up. Like, the issue is not just that there's some, because there isn't a contradiction between, for example, the God as described by Christianity being real and the writings about the Christian God being fabricated. The trouble comes in when you're trying to justify your belief in the former when your only basis for believing in the former is the latter.
Okay. So I just want to make sure that because this is complicated. So there's outline for me again simply what the two questions are. You want an example of basically like my rules for thee and not for thee. And your second question, I just don't think I caught it.
Oh, the second question is, what does God tell you? Is it simply that God gives you the objective truths, or is it God gives you the objective truths and then you interpret them in a relative way?
Okay, so I'm going to say some simple stuff that's going to be probably not very satisfying, and then you can ask me more about it.
No,
Does that
that's
work?
the most satisfying, but go ahead, yeah. Because
Okay,
I like
great.
brevity.
I'm going to start with the second one first, if that's okay with you, and then go back to the first one.
Sure.
Okay, so I'm a divine command theorist, but I function as a relativist because
She's a divine command theorist, but she functions as a relativist. That is simple, I'll grant that.
relativism is baked into God's divine command. So relativism, to me, is part of God's mandate for me.
But it's a mandate. That's not relativism. That's a contradiction, actually. You said there's a unitary code. You can't bake in a violation, a contradiction of a unitary code into a unitary. That doesn't make any sense.
So I'm a divine command theorist in that I believe that basically whatever God says is. Right? So if God says this is good, it is good.
Okay.
Fundamentally. The issue is that
No. A divine command theory says it is good because God commands it, not that if God commands it, it's good. You can have different causal mechanisms behind that. Oh, God damn it.
It's just
where were we? Hang on, we were like 20 minutes in, weren't we?
On like this thing, and I still Gnostic doesn't.
Okay. Relativist, because relativism is baked into God's divine command. So relativism, to me, is part of God's mandate for me. So I'm a divine command theorist in that I believe that basically whatever God says is.
Psychometricians aren't sending their best. They aren't sending anyone. There are no psychometricians on this panel.
Okay, so if God says this is good, it is good.
Okay.
Fundamentally. The issue is that I don't always know what God is saying, and I could be wrong.
Well, then I'm better than you, aren't I?
I function as a relativist because God expressly tells us to do this.
What? Where?
Wait.
Where?
So God tells you what is good and what is bad, but then you don't know what God is saying? Did I get
God expressly tells you to be a relativist. Where?
that correctly?
So God determines what is good and what is bad.
Okay.
And he tells you to be a relativist.
Okay, so God determines what is good and what is bad, but what is that part about, like, you don't know what God is saying specifically? Like, can you...
The issue is that sometimes it's hard to discern what specifically that means, right? Because I don't have, like, I joke about, like, having a single line up to God, but I can't just, like, be like, boop, 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 hey, God, like, is when Land Under the Plug does porn.
But God expressly tells you this? Can't have it both ways, Kyla. Either you don't know, or God expressly tells you. You can't say God expressly tells us, and then, but I don't know what he expressly tells us, and it's kind of hard to tell.
Is she committing a sin as a non-Christian?
So how do you... So my question to you then is this: how do you discern that then, right? Like, how do you discern what is good and what is wrong, and how do I know that you aren't twisting some morals to your advantage or to like to others' disadvantages, like to justify some things that are, you know, weird or whatever, right? Like
in Romans, we've already checked this. I somehow skimmed over it when I was actually looking in the book itself, but in the letter of Paul to the church in Rome, we have a clear statement that there is a law written upon the hearts of even the non-believers. That's not relativism. That's actually an assertion of a quite objective law and a validation of Christian law as an elaboration upon that, or as in some sense rooted upon that. That's not relativistic at all. That's actually saying there's not even a possibility of relativism because that root, and this is consistent throughout a lot of Christian history. In fact, there's a really good section on precisely this in Brent Nongbri's fantastic and concise book, Before Religion, The History of a Modern Concept, which I highly, highly recommend, in which he goes over the different conceptions of religion in historiography, and especially Christian historiography, in which at one point they regarded the social benefits that accrued from non-Christian religions as being a consequence of these religions being deviations from the one true religion going back to Adam and Eve. So this is a remarkably ahistorical position on the part of erudite, but it's also, that's understandable. A lot of people don't know this history. A lot of people think they know this history and they don't. What's a little bit baffling is saying that God commands relativism. Dear friends, the writers of the New Testament, and certainly the Old Testament, didn't have a notion of morality, much less a notion of a relative or neutral stance to different moral systems. That is extremely modern. Extremely modern even by reference to people like Thomas Hobbes. You'll notice you don't read that kind of language in him in English.
Like, how
yeah,
do
is
you
there like a
determine that
consistency? Is there a consistency,
or is it
that
just
you see with,
convenient
like,
to
what
you?
God is telling you that you're saying, like, I see. It seems like God is saying things are good based on this specific system, and so I think that that's the system that He wants us to use. Or are you like picking and choosing?
Or are you just
when
100% disingenuous and it's just convenient, evidently?
Okay. There's a lot of loading in there. So the issue is we're basically asking about sin, right? As a divine command theorist. That's what we're asking about.
Okay.
And I'm going to say some stuff that sounds very judgmental, but I'm not meaning it this way. This is just like the reality.
Sure, no problem. I don't
Regards to
believe in gay marriage
non-Christians.
either. Yeah.
That's not what I was going to say.
I'm kidding.
in
I'm kidding on
regards
that.
to
Sorry.
So I don't really care about the sins of non-Christians because it's pretty irrelevant, because biblically they're considered like dead, right? So like me being like, oh no, is Lena the Plug doing sin? It's like, she's not a Christian. Who fucking cares? As far as Christian morality goes, it's not even important.
Actually, by the by, here's what it actually says. Because there's a flip side to this. There is a flip side to this. Matthew 7. Yeah. Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is the log in your own eye? You hypocrite! Oh, god damn it! Get back there! Okay. Oh my god. You hypocrite! First take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. This might even sound like a relativistic statement, except what it actually is saying, no, you are in violation of a law that persists regardless of your perception. Why? Because your perception of the sin of your brother, that is conditioned. How you respond to that is conditioned by whether or not you yourself are also in sin, potentially in more serious sin, if, for instance, you are judging your neighbor's well-being in sin, because now you are a toxic element, so to speak. And here's a section that this is the relevant one for erudite. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. On that day many will say to me, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and cast out demons in your name, and do many mighty works in your name? And then I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you evildoers. Kyla.
It's such an unimportant question. So it's like, could I hypothetically try to do it? Sure. I'd need to like reason it out, and it's like hard to know because I think sin is very much about like knowledge. And so it's like, well, if Lena the Plug has any reason based on like her circumstances and anything to believe that maybe what she's doing is wrong, it might be a sin. And if she was a Christian, it definitely might be a sin. But also like she's not a Christian, so I don't know, right? So it's like it's this like practice that I'm being asked to do that to me is like deeply meaningless.
Like, think of how insane this is. The entire base... her response to, oh, other people are living in sin who are non-Christians, who cares? What was John the Baptist doing? Why was Jesus ministering and attending the dinners of tax collectors? Jesus is very particular. It's the sick who need a doctor. When he was criticized by the Pharisees for interacting with sinners, that's precisely what he said. It's the sick, not the well, who need treatment. Those are the only people you should be caring about. That it's remarkable. Like, this is basic. The New Testament is not, and which is the basis of a Christian doctrine, is thin. This is the Bible, right? The whole thing. A lot of words. These are thin pages. This is the New Testament. Not particularly onerous.
Knowing whether a non-Christian...
When you say that because she's not a Christian, she's like are you saying that she's like outside of the moral framework because she's you like basically it's a zero-sum game? If you're not Christian...
She's not outside of the moral framework. Gentiles have the law of God written upon their hearts, and by that they are condemned in Christian theology. I disagree, but...
And then you're like going to hell? Is it that kind of thing, or is it just that like
It's
she's outside of
immaterial.
that framework?
It's
Material.
immaterial.
No,
Yeah,
it's not.
because until like basically
Okay.
like Christian theology, right? We believe in like heart regeneration. Basically, until a heart is regenerated, worrying about their sin is kind of meaningless because heart regeneration is the beginning. That's like salvation, right? That's the most important fundamental step.
Salvation from what, erudite? If the sin doesn't matter, then they aren't condemned. They're condemned precisely because of sin, because the law is written upon their hearts as recorded in Romans.
Of where conversations about sin even begin. After that, it's like you're just like it's just like empty worrying and condemning. And so I can still determine morality of non-Christians, but I'm not going to use it on like whether I think what they're doing is sin specifically.
So what about Sprouticus? Like, do you think that morals are just coming from what the Bible is telling you, or do you think that it's something that like, are you finding some sort of system that you're supposed to abide by?
I go by I was hoping that she would still be here, but I go by the conviction of the Holy Spirit. So I think that I think the Holy Spirit will convict.
She can
okay, so yeah, I think the Holy Spirit will convict me if I'm doing something wrong, and that is where I'll take my correction from. And of course that can come from people and stuff like that. But I was gonna ask. Wouldn't it somewhat be easier just to kind of like utilize what Paul said when it came to talking about Christians and whether or not they should eat of the meat that was sold by pagans to pagan gods,
Romans
and basically
14?
saying that if you are convicted by it, not to do it, but if you're not convicted by it,
Romans 14. Let's check that. Does she mean the chapter Romans 14? Here we go. As for the man who is weak in faith, welcome him, but not for disputes over opinions. One believes he may eat anything, while the weak man eats only vegetables. Let not him who eats despise him who abstains, and let not him who abstains pass judgment on him who eats, for God has welcomed him. Who are you to pass judgment on the servant of another? It is before his own master that he stands or falls, and he will be upheld, for the master is able to make him stand. The other for whom he's a servant is not another god, it's the Christian God. That's the point. They wouldn't write with confidence that their master would be able to make him stand if the master was Baal, for example. One man esteems like this is towards the church in Rome, right? That's what the letter from Paul is for. Pagans weren't taking letters from Paul. And indeed, churches were exclusive back in the day. They didn't just welcome anybody in. Getting in was a slow process. There's an interesting, I'm not going to say it's a good book, but there's a book, I have it on my other shelf, called The Patient Ferment of the Early Church. And it talks about how entrance into the church was a very long, slow process. At one point. It's not all of the book, but, oh god, my neck is killing me. But that's a major component. That's not the meat of other gods.
not really an issue with it, but don't do it in front of someone who's convicted.
Let me double check. Hang on. I want to make absolutely certain. Romans 14. What the hell is she talking about? The gospel for Jews and Gentiles alike. Welcome one another, therefore, as Christ has welcomed you, for the glory of God. For I tell you that Christ became a servant to the circumcised to show God's truthfulness, in order to confirm the promises given to the patriarchs, and in order that the Gentiles might glorify God for his mercy. There's nothing about food sacrificed to other gods in here. Could she be talking about the apparition on the rooftop? where I think Peter was shown prior to meeting Paul, if my chronology is correct, animals that were forbidden for Jews to eat, and they're offered to him to eat, and then he denies them, and then God says, or a voice says, I think it was God. God says, "What God has made clean, you can eat," or something like that. But that's in Acts. Hang on, let's see. This is before Paul is called Paul. It's called Saul originally. We'll find it later.
Did by it in order not to stumble, in order not to make your brother stumble.
Matthew 7:1. Oh, was it in Matthew, really? It's not in Matthew, but that's the gospel. What's Matthew 7:1? No, that's the one we read before.
Exactly. And that is
Why are we in Bible study? Blame Kyle, it's not me.
what you're describing there is the fundamental moral relativist position that I believe God
It was God in Acts, yeah. I just want to make sure. Sometimes it's non-specific.
imparts on Christians. This is why essentially what he's saying is worrying about whether or not a non-Christian is doing sin isn't super important, because sin is very much about like the knowledge that you have, and until a heart is regenerated,
No, you're specifically concerned. Those verses are about judging fellow Christians. You're specifically concerned with non-Christians doing sin. This is why Paul was trying to baptize the Roman soldiers as they came to arrest him. That's the entire point. The sin of non-Christians is what condemns them, and they have the knowledge of sin written on their heart, so it's not even a question of whether or not they are condemned. That's pretty clearly stated. The only purpose to that line is precisely to show, first of all, to validate the laws given in Christian writings, but secondly, to show that they are also accountable under a Christian view. That's kind of the whole point.
they don't have like the Holy Spirit conviction.
Like, think about how perverse it would be if that wasn't the case. You're spreading the gospel only to condemn people. That'd be perverse. They're not stupid. These people were clever. They wrote voluminously. They thought about this stuff. You wouldn't include a clause in your scripture that gives you a clear negative reason for gives you a clear reason for not spreading the gospel. That wouldn't make any sense. If spreading the law condemns, you would not spread the law. You would want to keep people in ignorance so that they have as much of a chance as possible of getting by on their individual virtue or something. But if everybody's condemned because they all have the law written on the inside, then you have a major impetus, because the law by itself only condemns, and it condemns everybody, so they need some other interference to save them.
Telling them that they're doing sin. So I can still weigh in, again, as a relativist, about whether I think what they're doing is immoral based on their own personal beliefs and all sorts of stuff.
What's this about the heart?
Most people do.
I'm a bit confused about the heart part. Like, can you? But
okay,
is this more of a faith thing that like if I don't have the faith, then this isn't exactly something I should get into, or because I don't want this to turn to like a 2-hour discussion about the heart of whatever, but you know.
So just think of like it's a theological concept, the gospel of regeneration. I'm trying to think of like a really simple way to explain it. If Spartacus, if you have any way to explain it simply, because I think you believe in a heart.
There are effects of sin upon the human psyche that cause you to tend to want to commit more sin, etc., etc. And so there's a concept that when you are saved, as a part of that process, you are returned to your natural, to your pre-sin state increasingly, so that you want less and less to do evil and you want more and more to do good, because a major principle of Christian thought is that sinful human beings don't want to do good. They actually want to do evil, and they can easily convince themselves that doing evil is doing good and vice versa.
Somebody said
regeneration as
intuition
well.
slash
Yes, I do.
instinct in the chat. Is that what a heart is?
Yes.
No.
So-
no, no,
Yes.
no,
Yes.
No.
This is
Yes.
a very specific theological thing about salvation. So basically,
Yes, your intuitions and your inclinations. That's what the heart refers to. It's not referring to a pumping organ. Maybe it's also referring to that, but they understood by that to be the bearer of the thing which wants and desires, etc., etc. This is why Paul writes that his heart desires the things that are bad and not the things that are good, sort of over against him. There's a conflict within himself.
fuck, I'm trying to think
The
about how to explain
soul?
this simply. Yeah, sure.
So-
The soul.
The heart is basically it's you're very kind of like
This sounds Aristotelian. You put your finger on something. There's a reason why the language of the New Testament is very amenable to Platonism.
intuition. So back when these words were written down, there was the heart and the mind. So the mind was kind of like what was intellectual, whereas the heart was more so emotional. So like if you felt emotions, it came from the heart. If it was more so intellectual, it came from the mind. So that's you have to kind of take that into consideration when you're looking at things when talking about the difference between the heart and the mind.
Well, so once you're
okay.
saved, you're like the idea is that once you're saved and once you've like been born again, that you have like an inner voice that kind of tells you what to do and what,
Right, you're
what
no
is right
longer
and wrong,
just based
and
on
you're
the
being
emotions
led
of your
and-
flesh and blood.
Right.
And
It's,
you're saying what
kind
your
of.
heart tells you is right or wrong, or like how does this relate to the moral part again?
It depends if you're saved or not. It
The
depends
gospel
if
of
it's regenerated.
regeneration is about basically whether or not like your soul, your spirit, or whatever is alive and existent, which God has to do to reach you. And if that exists, then all
You know what I'm going to do? You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to send some of you somewhere, okay? I'm going to send some of you somewhere. Because apparently, Food Shops is watching the stream as we go. So why don't you pop into her stream, give her a couple subs, and say hello. Links in the chat.
all of a sudden sin becomes relevant, because before then it doesn't mean that non-Christians can't do sin. They can. The issue is that it's really unimportant, and one of the biggest things pushed on Christians by Jesus is to not worry a bunch, particularly about non-Christians' sin. It's extremely non-consequential for you.
The entire purpose of the Great Commission is that you don't worry about your personal well-being or anything related to yourself, and you go forth in poverty and spread the word precisely because the sin of non-believers is your only concern, because it dooms them. That's the entire premise of Christianity.
So I
Because
have
hard regeneration hasn't occurred before.
Sure, I have a
See,
hypothetical
I-
for you, Erudite.
It's like faith.
Yeah, so for example, right, let's just say we have two Christians, okay, and one Christian is a thief and steals and this person steals a bag of chips because he wants to feed, his little brother, because his little brother is about to starve to death, right? And this is situation one. Now situation two is this Christian is doing OnlyFans and is basically doing not just OnlyFans but just basically doing Pornhub stuff and is a porn star, right? So in for the porn star example, to you, is that morally good or is that morally bad?
Okay, so these are two separate hypotheticals that have nothing to do
Right.
with each other. Just to be
Right,
clear.
they have nothing to do with each other, but I just want to gauge your opinions on these two different scenarios.
Okay, so in the one, so you want to know? Okay, sorry. So in one, you want to know about whether a Christian doing OnlyFans and is a porn star, if they're in sin.
Yeah. Wait,
Okay,
in
what
sin
do they think about
is in sin and morally bad consistent in your mind?
No, not
No.
always. Because not everything that I would say,
Oh.
yeah, because not everything that we would agree like culturally is immoral. Like censorship is probably immoral. I don't think it's a sin.
You think censorship is immoral, but it's not what the hell does that mean? That doesn't make any sense. What do you mean by immoral, then? The only reason why morality would even come into the equation is if it's something that's universally required. Otherwise, you're not talking about the moral, you're simply talking about the customary. What is she talking about?
Yeah, but that's kind of that's going.
Yeah,
well,
but
so
even like within your construct, you just bring up the Magdalene, and it's like, yeah, there's no knowledge there. That's effectively what you're saying, right?
What?
Just because
Like the
something
idea
may be
of
bad to do doesn't mean it rises to the level of sin.
You're
Right,
saying
'cause
that
sin
if
is
there's some
specific
sort of
things.
bad outcome, whereas like a sin is like against God, whereas like a negative outcome is more of
No,
like
No, sin is like you sin at the level of being aroused by a member of the opposite sex in a room. Literally. You sin at the level of being angry at someone, even if you don't manifest that at all. There are lines in the Bible to the effect that if you're angry at somebody, this is like Christ says this, if you're angry, you've effectively murdered somebody else. Doesn't matter if you don't act it out at all. It's the same thing. That's how you're rated. So to say that you can have immoral but not sinful actions or policies or attitudes or whatever is the complete reverse of the actual case. Avoiding sin is extraordinarily difficult. Extraordinarily. You can passively sin, for example. I can't imagine what on earth something that is both immoral but not sinful would be. Moreover, we only use the language of morality in order to systematize Christian ethics. So when Kant, for example, is talking about what is the moral, and he gives like the first articulation of a truly deontological account, his entire point is that the moral has to come from outside, because insofar as we are talking about the moral, insofar as we're talking about something as being moral and not merely pragmatic, we're talking about something that is universally an ought. We universally, in all cases, ought to pursue da-da-da-da. And the problem with universals is that they're not particular, they're general. And so insofar as we are talking about anything pertaining to the human or to the cultural, we are talking about something that is particularized and is therefore not identical with the moral. And therefore the only thing ultimately that determines the moral from the immoral is its relationship to some extra human good beyond even our perception, which is also conditioned. Which is why his notion of the moral or the good is pretty impoverished. It's only the categorical imperative. It's only the categorical, actually. And so to say that you can have that which is immoral but also not a sin is absurd. No, not at all. The sinful is determined by being the immoral. It's possible that you can't reason your way to encompassing all of the sinful things by this logic. Like, it's possible that the sinful is also further determined, but the immoral will always be encompassed by sin.
You can sin against a
Utilitarian
person.
side.
You can sin against your brother.
You can sin against the
Sin is
flesh.
basically when you do something that like you know is wrong and is wrong and also offends God.
No. It's not when you do something that you know is wrong and also offends God. It's just doing something wrong. You're able to not know something is wrong, quote unquote, because let's unpack that content. What does that mean philosophically? What is wrong? What is wrongness? To say you do something knowing it is wrong is to say you have knowledge of it having the status of being wrong. But what if you don't have a notion of wrongness? What if you don't have a notion of morality? What if you don't have a notion of sin? Adam and Eve were condemned without the knowledge of good and evil. They ate the fruit before gaining it, right? They got the knowledge of good and evil and of their nakedness from eating the fruit. They were condemned, therefore, without the knowledge of good and evil. This is...
Right, so like taking the Lord's name in vain. would
So
be,
the
like,
difference is
probably
that
a
it
sin.
offends God.
No, there's two qualifiers that I gave there.
So the first one is that it offends God, and the second one is
Sin is something that you know is wrong and you do it anyways. Or it offends
you
God.
know it's wrong and you do it anyway. So you know, according to your moral relativism, that it is wrong and you do it anyway. Correct?
Right. So
I
say
mean,
that
there's also
Christians-
like
Yeah,
sinning
by
of
the
the
moral
heart
system.
as well, but
All right, this is going on for another hour and a half. I'm going to call it here, but I'm going to send you all to Food Shops because I think she's asking some interesting questions, and I would like to see her commentary as well. So let me make sure that I can. Food Shops, if you're watching this, which I think you still are, make sure that I have redirect permissions. In fact, make sure everybody does because there's no reason not to. I'm gonna send some friends your way. Swell. There we go. Tell them Sunday sent you.